What happens when a struggling single father saves a little girl's life, only to discover her mother is a billionaire who could change everything? Stay with me until the end of this incredible story and comment your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled around the world. The morning mist clung to the Colorado foothills like a whispered secret, and Daniel Cross stood at his kitchen window, watching it swirl around the towering pines that had become his only neighbors since moving to this forgotten corner of the world. His calloused hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, the same one Sarah had bought him 5 years ago, back when laughter still echoed through these walls, and the future seemed painted in brighter colors. "Dad, you're doing that thing again." 8-year-old Ethan's voice cut through the silence, carrying that peculiar mix of wisdom and innocence that seemed to define children who'd grown up too fast. Daniel turned from his window, forcing a smile, as he watched his son pour syrup over a stack of pancakes that looked more like abstract art than breakfast. Ethan's dark hair stuck up in defiant cowlicks, and his mismatched socks, one Spider-Man, one plain blue, somehow captured the beautiful chaos of their life together. "What thing?" Daniel asked, though he knew exactly what his son meant. "The staring thing. The thinking too much thing." Ethan took a massive bite of pancake syrup, threatening to drip onto his already stained superhero t-shirt. "Mom used to say you did that when you were worried about stuff." The mention of Sarah still hit like a sucker punch even after 3 years. Daniel had learned to breathe through it, to let the pain wash over him, without drowning in it. But some mornings like this one, the grief felt as fresh as mountain snow. "I'm not worried," Daniel lied, settling into the chair across from his son. "Just thinking about our hike today. Cascade Falls is a pretty serious trail." Ethan's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that only 8-year-olds could muster for something as simple as a walk in the woods. "You think we'll see any bears?" "Let's hope not." Daniel reached across the small table and ruffled his son's hair. "But if we do, you remember what I taught you. Make myself look big, back away slowly, and don't run unless you say to." Ethan recited the wilderness safety rules with the same precision he used for his multiplication tables. "And if a mountain lion shows up, I throw rocks and yell really loud." "That's my boy." Daniel felt a familiar swell of pride, mixed with the ever-present worry that seemed to be his constant companion these days. Raising a child alone in the middle of nowhere wasn't exactly what he'd planned when he'd quit the Denver Fire Department and bought this small cabin with Sarah's life insurance money. But sometimes, the best plans were the ones that fell apart, forcing you to build something entirely new from the wreckage. The hardware store where Daniel worked part-time wasn't opening until noon on Saturday, which meant they had the entire morning for their weekly adventure. These hikes had become their tradition, a way to honor Sarah's memory while creating new ones of their own. She'd been the adventurous one in the family, always pushing them to explore new trails, to find beauty in the wild places that most people never bothered to see. "Can we take the long way today?" Ethan asked, already bouncing in his chair with anticipation. "The one that goes past the really tall waterfall. That's a 5-mile hike, buddy. You sure you're up for it?" Ethan flexed his skinny arms in a show of mock strength that made Daniel laugh despite himself. "I've been training," the boy declared solemnly. "I did 10 push-ups yesterday. Well, almost 10. Okay, 5. But they were really good ones." Daniel couldn't help but grin. His son's optimism was infectious, a bright spot in days that sometimes felt painted in shades of gray. "All right, Cascade Falls it is. But we pack extra water and snacks, and if you get tired, you tell me. No heroes, okay?" "No heroes." Ethan agreed, though the mischievous glint in his eyes suggested he was already planning to prove just how tough he could be. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of shared mornings and unspoken understanding. Daniel watched his son eat, marveling at how much Ethan had grown in just the past few months. He was losing that baby roundness in his face, developing the sharp angles that would someday make him look like his mother. It was a bittersweet realization, proud and heartbreaking all at once. By 9 o'clock, they were loading their day packs with water bottles, trail mix, and the emergency first aid kit that Daniel never left home without. Old habits from his firefighting days died hard, and he'd learned the hard way that the mountains could turn dangerous without warning. "Dad, do you think Mom would have liked this hike?" Ethan asked as they laced up their boots on the front porch. The question caught Daniel off guard, as Ethan's memories of Sarah often did. The boy had been only 5 when she died, and sometimes Daniel worried that his son's memories of his mother were more imagination than reality, built from photographs and stories rather than genuine recollection. "She would have loved it," Daniel said, and meant it. "Your mom was always the one pushing us to go higher, to see what was around the next bend. She used to say that mountains were where God went to think." Ethan nodded seriously, as if filing this information away with all the other pieces of his mother he collected like precious stones. "Maybe we'll see her up there." Daniel's throat tightened. "Maybe we will." The drive to the Cascade Falls trailhead took 40 minutes through winding mountain roads that carved through forests of aspen and pine. Daniel's old pickup truck groaned up the inclines, its engine protesting the altitude, but it had never failed them yet. The radio crackled with static and the occasional snippet of a country song, but mostly they drove in comfortable silence, watching the landscape change from valley meadows to rocky peaks dusted with early snow. The parking area at the trailhead was nearly empty. Just one other car, a sleek black SUV with out-of-state plates that looked expensive and out of place among the dusty pickups and well-worn Subarus that usually populated these mountain lots. "Tourists," Ethan observed with the dismissive tone of a local, despite having lived in Colorado for only 3 years. "Nothing wrong with tourists," Daniel said, shouldering his pack. "They help keep places like this protected." The trail started gently winding through a meadow dotted with late-season wildflowers. Indian paintbrush and mountain lupine painted splashes of red and purple against the golden grass, and somewhere overhead, a hawk circled on thermals that rose from the warming earth. Ethan chattered as they walked, pointing out interesting rocks and asking questions about everything from why leaves changed color to whether aliens might live on other planets. Daniel answered as best he could, enjoying the easy rhythm of their conversation and the steady burn in his legs as the trail began to climb. They'd been hiking for about an hour when the first screams echoed across the valley. Daniel stopped so abruptly that Ethan walked into his back, stumbling slightly before catching his balance. The sound came again, high, desperate, and undeniably human. A child's voice calling for help from somewhere off the main trail. "Dad." Ethan's voice was small, uncertain. Daniel was already dropping his pack, his firefighter training kicking in with an almost physical jolt. "Stay right here," he ordered, his voice sharp with authority. "Don't move from this spot, understand?" "But Dad." "Ethan." Daniel gripped his son's shoulders, looking directly into his wide brown eyes. "I need you to be my spotter. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, you hike back to the parking lot and get help. Can you do that for me?" Ethan nodded, though Daniel could see the fear creeping into his young face. "Is someone hurt?" "I don't know yet, but I need to find out." Daniel pulled out his phone, checking for signal. 1 bar, barely enough for a call if things went really wrong. He handed Ethan his own phone. "Emergency services is 911, okay, but only if I don't come back." The screams came again, closer now, and Daniel could hear the panic in them. Without another word, he plunged into the underbrush, following the sound, through thick stands of oak brush and scattered boulders. The terrain off-trail was treacherous, all loose rock and hidden drop-offs. Daniel moved as quickly as he dared, his heart pounding, with a familiar mixture of adrenaline and dread. He'd heard cries like this before, in burning buildings, and after car accidents, and they never meant anything good. "Help, please, somebody help me." The voice was definitely a child's, a girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old. Daniel pushed through a stand of scrub oak and found himself at the edge of a ravine he hadn't known existed. 20 feet below, a massive aspen tree lay across the narrow canyon, its trunk easily 3 feet in diameter. And beneath that trunk, partially trapped and very much alive, was a young girl with dark hair and tears streaming down her dirt-stained face. "Hey there," Daniel called down, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd perfected during years of emergency response. "I'm here to help. Are you okay?" The girl looked up, relief flooding her features. "My leg is stuck. I can't get out." Daniel quickly assessed the situation, his mind automatically cataloging potential problems and solutions. The girl appeared to be caught beneath the fallen tree, but she was conscious and alert, which was a good sign. The bad news was that she was at least 20 feet down in a ravine with steep, unstable sides. "What's your name?" he called down, already scanning for the safest way to reach her. Lily Hale." "Okay, Lily, I'm Daniel. I'm coming down to help you, but I need you to stay very still, okay? Don't try to move." Daniel found a relatively stable path down the ravine wall, using exposed roots and rock outcroppings as handholds. Every step sent small avalanches of loose stones skittering down toward the trapped girl, and he winced each time, hoping nothing would hit her. When he finally reached the bottom, he could see the full extent of the problem. The massive aspen had fallen across the narrow ravine, creating a natural bridge about 6 feet off the ground. Lily had apparently tried to climb over it and gotten her right leg pinned between the trunk and a large boulder. Her hiking boot was twisted at an angle that made Daniel's stomach clench. "How long have you been stuck here?" he asked, kneeling beside her to examine the situation more closely. "I don't know, a long time. Hours, maybe." Lily's voice was shaky but controlled. "I was trying to find a shortcut back to the trail when the tree shifted. I think my leg might be broken." Daniel gently probed the area around the trapped limb, noting the swelling and the unnatural angle of her ankle. "Yeah, I think you might be right. But the good news is, I used to be a firefighter, so I've dealt with situations like this before." "Really?" Some of the fear left Lily's eyes, replaced by a spark of hope. "Really? Now I'm going to need to move this tree to get you out. But first I want to stabilize your leg so we don't make anything worse." Daniel shrugged out of his jacket and began tearing it into strips. "This might hurt a little, but I need you to be brave, okay?" Lily nodded, biting her lip, as Daniel carefully fashioned a makeshift splint around her injured ankle. She was tougher than most adults he'd worked with, barely making a sound as he secured the improvised bandage. "You're being incredibly brave," he told her as he worked. "Where are your parents? Are they hiking with you?" "Just my mom. She went back to get the car when I told her I wanted to explore a little more." Lily's voice carried a note of guilt. "She told me not to go off the trail, but I thought I saw a shortcut." "Well, we all make mistakes," Daniel said gently. "The important thing is getting you out of here safely." With the splint in place, Daniel turned his attention to the fallen tree. It was massive, easily several tons of dead weight, but it was also balanced precariously between the ravine walls. If he could find the right leverage point, he might be able to shift it just enough to free Lily's leg. "I'm going to try to move this tree," he explained. "When I do, I need you to pull yourself backward as quickly as you can, okay? Don't worry about your leg, just get clear." Daniel found a sturdy branch that could serve as a lever and positioned it against the trunk near where Lily was trapped. He put his full weight behind it, his muscles straining against the enormous mass of the tree. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound like thunder, the trunk shifted slightly, rising just a few inches off the boulder that had Lily pinned. "Now!" Daniel shouted. Lily scrambled backward, crying out, as her injured leg dragged against the ground, but she managed to pull herself clear, just as Daniel's makeshift lever snapped and the tree settled back into place with a resonating thud. "I did it!" Lily gasped, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I'm free!" But Daniel's relief was short-lived. Getting Lily out from under the tree was only the first challenge. Now he had to figure out how to get an injured child up a 20-foot ravine wall and several miles back to the trailhead. And somewhere out there, Lily's mother was probably panicking about her missing daughter. "Can you put any weight on that leg?" he asked. Lily tried to stand, but immediately collapsed with a sharp cry of pain. "No, it hurts too much." Daniel looked up at the ravine walls, calculating distances and angles. There was no way Lily could climb out on her own, and he wasn't sure he could carry her up the steep, unstable slope. But there might be another option. "Lily, I need to go get my son and some rope from my pack. I'll be back in 10 minutes, I promise." "Don't leave me." The panic in her voice was immediate and absolute. "I'm not leaving you," Daniel said firmly. "I'm going to get help so I can get you out of here safely. You've been incredibly brave so far. I need you to be brave just a little bit longer." He was already moving toward the ravine wall when Lily called out again. "Daniel." "Yeah, thank you." The climb back up felt like it took forever, though. Daniel knew it was probably only a few minutes. His mind was racing, calculating what he'd need to safely extract an injured child from the ravine. Rope, definitely. Maybe some sort of pulley system if he could improvise one. And he'd need Ethan's help, which meant bringing his 8-year-old son into a potentially dangerous rescue situation. He found Ethan exactly where he'd left him, sitting on a fallen log and clutching Daniel's phone with white knuckles. "Dad, you were gone for almost 20 minutes. I was about to call for help." "Good man," Daniel said, already digging through his pack for the length of climbing rope he always carried on mountain hikes. "There's a girl trapped in a ravine about a quarter mile that way. Her leg's broken, and I need your help to get her out." Ethan's eyes went wide. "Are we going to be heroes?" "We're going to help someone who needs help," Daniel corrected gently. "That's what people do for each other." Together they gathered everything Daniel thought he might need: rope, carabiners, first aid supplies, and extra water. Then they made their way back through the underbrush to the ravine, Ethan following close behind and peppering his father with questions about rescue techniques and whether the girl was going to be okay. "Lily," Daniel called down as they approached the edge. "I'm back, and I brought help." The girl looked up and her face brightened when she saw Ethan peering down at her. "Hi," she called up, managing a smile despite her obvious pain. "Are you Daniel's son?" "I'm Ethan," the boy replied proudly. "We're going to get you out of there." Daniel rigged a simple rope system using a large pine tree as an anchor point. It wasn't perfect, but it would allow him to rappel down to Lily and then help her climb back up with minimal stress on her injured leg. "This might be a little scary," he told her as he prepared to lower himself back into the ravine. "But I promise you're going to be okay." What followed was one of the most challenging rescues Daniel had ever attempted, even during his firefighting days. Getting Lily secured in a makeshift harness while keeping her injured leg stable required all of his technical knowledge and more patience than he'd known he possessed. Ethan proved invaluable as a spotter and equipment manager, following Daniel's instructions, with the kind of focus that made his father burst with pride. It took nearly an hour to get Lily out of the ravine. By the time Daniel finally hauled her over the edge, all three of them were exhausted, dirty, and emotionally drained. But they'd done it. "We did it!" Ethan cheered, dancing around in a circle. "We really did it!" Lily was crying again, but these were tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered to Daniel. "Thank you so much." But the rescue was far from over. They still had to get Lily back to the trailhead, and with her broken leg, that meant Daniel would have to carry her the entire 3 miles back to the parking area. "This might be uncomfortable," he warned her, as he fashioned a makeshift carrier using his pack and the climbing rope. "But it's the only way to get you back to help." "I don't care," Lily said bravely. "Anything's better than being stuck in that hole." The hike back was a test of endurance that pushed Daniel to his limits. Lily was small for her age, probably no more than 80 pounds, but carrying dead weight over rough terrain for 3 miles was like running a marathon with a boulder strapped to his back. Ethan helped by carrying both day packs and staying alert for obstacles in the trail, proving once again that 8-year-olds were capable of far more than most adults gave them credit for. They were still a mile from the parking area when they heard the helicopter. It appeared suddenly over the ridgeline, a sleek black aircraft that looked more like something from a movie than a typical search and rescue chopper. It circled overhead twice before setting down in a meadow just off the trail, its rotors whipping the grass into a frenzy. "That's for me," Lily said quietly, and something in her tone made Daniel look at her more carefully. 3 people emerged from the helicopter. 2 men in expensive suits who looked completely out of place in the wilderness, and a woman who made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. She was tall and elegant, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and clothing that somehow managed to look both practical and impossibly expensive. But it was her face that stopped him cold, the same delicate features as the girl on his back, the same intelligent dark eyes, but set in an expression of barely controlled panic. "Lily!" the woman cried, running toward them with a desperation that was painful to watch. "Oh God, Lily, are you okay?" "I'm okay, Mom," Lily called back weakly. "This is Daniel. He saved me." The woman reached them just as Daniel was lowering Lily carefully to the ground, and for a moment, their eyes met over the injured child. Up close, she was even more striking, and even more obviously out of Daniel's league. This wasn't the kind of woman you met at small-town hardware stores or community barbecues. This was the kind of woman who graced magazine covers and boardroom meetings. "I'm Victoria Hale," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Lily's mother. I can't begin to thank you for what you've done." Daniel noticed that she didn't offer her hand to be shaken, so much as presented, as if she expected it to be kissed. He settled for a brief, businesslike grip. "Daniel Cross. And this is my son, Ethan." Victoria's gaze flicked to the 8-year-old boy, who was watching the proceedings with wide-eyed fascination, then back to Daniel. "You both helped rescue her." "Ethan was essential," Daniel said firmly. "I couldn't have done it without him." One of the suited men approached, speaking in low, urgent tones to Victoria. Daniel caught fragments of the conversation, something about schedules and meetings and people waiting. Victoria's responses were sharp and dismissive, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing between her daughter and the helicopter, as if calculating competing priorities. "We need to get Lily to a hospital," Daniel said, breaking into their whispered conference. "Her ankle's definitely broken, and she should be checked for other injuries." "Of course," Victoria said immediately, her attention snapping back to her daughter. "There's a medical team standing by at Denver General." She knelt beside Lily, smoothing the girl's tangled hair with gentle fingers. "Baby, how are you feeling? Does anything else hurt?" Just my ankle, Lily assured her. Daniel made it so it doesn't hurt as much. He used to be a firefighter. Victoria looked up at Daniel with something that might have been respect. A firefighter. Used to be, Daniel confirmed. I work at the hardware store in town now. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to mention his current decidedly unglamorous employment, but something about Victoria Hale made him acutely aware of the gulf between their circumstances. She probably spent more on a single outfit than he made in a month. Well, we owe you an enormous debt, Victoria said, rising gracefully to her feet. Both of you. I'd like to find some way to properly thank you. No thanks necessary, Daniel replied automatically. Anyone would have done the same thing. Victoria's smile was brief but genuine. No, Mr. Cross. Not everyone would have risked their safety to save a stranger's child, and certainly not everyone would have had the skill to do it successfully. One of the helicopter's medical team appeared with a stretcher, and the next few minutes were a flurry of professional activity as they examined Lily and prepared her for transport. Daniel found himself standing awkwardly to one side, with Ethan feeling suddenly superfluous now that the real rescuers had arrived. Dad, Ethan whispered, tugging on his sleeve. Why does that lady talk so fancy? Shh, Daniel whispered back, though he'd been wondering the same thing. Victoria Hale's accent was cultured and precise, the kind that spoke of expensive education and rarefied social circles. Everything about her, from her clothes to her bearing, to the casual way she commanded the attention of everyone around her, suggested wealth and power on a scale that Daniel could barely comprehend. As the medical team loaded Lily onto the stretcher, she reached out toward Daniel and Ethan. Wait, I want to say goodbye. Victoria looked between her daughter and her rescuers, and for a moment her composed mask slipped. Daniel saw something raw and grateful in her expression, something that transformed her from an intimidating stranger into a mother who'd almost lost her child. Lily wants to see you, she said simply, stepping aside so Daniel and Ethan could approach the stretcher. Thank you, Lily said, reaching out to squeeze Daniel's hand. For everything. You too, Ethan. Will you be okay? Ethan asked with the serious concern that children reserved for other children. I'll be fine, Lily assured him. The doctors will fix my leg and then I'll be good as new. Victoria appeared beside the stretcher, and Daniel noticed that she'd somehow produced a business card from her expensive outdoor jacket. Mr. Cross, I meant what I said about finding a way to thank you properly. Please call me when you have a chance. Daniel looked down at the card, and his breath caught. The name meant nothing to him, but the company logo did a stylized mountain peak that he'd seen on billboards and in magazines usually associated with luxury resorts and high-end outdoor gear. Hale Enterprises, he read aloud. Among other things, Victoria said with a smile that was both mysterious and apologetic. Call me Mr. Cross, please. And then she was gone, swept away in a flurry of rotor wash and expensive efficiency, leaving Daniel and Ethan standing alone in the sudden quiet of the mountain meadow. Dad, Ethan said after a long moment, I think that lady might be really, really rich. Daniel looked down at the business card in his hand, then up at the disappearing helicopter. Yeah, buddy, I think you might be right. The walk back to their truck felt surreal after the intensity of the rescue. Daniel's body was finally registering the strain of carrying Lily for 3 miles, and every muscle in his back and shoulders ached with the aftermath of adrenaline. But more than the physical exhaustion was the strange emotional hangover that came from such an intense encounter with strangers who had touched their lives so briefly and dramatically. Are we going to see them again? Ethan asked as they reached the parking area. Daniel looked at the business card again, noting the Denver address and the string of phone numbers and email addresses printed in elegant script. I don't know, buddy. They live in a very different world than we do. But we helped them, Ethan said with the simple logic of childhood. That makes us friends, right? Daniel thought about Victoria Hale's composed elegance, her obvious wealth and sophistication, the way she'd commanded the respect and attention of everyone around her. Then he thought about his own life, the modest cabin, the part-time job at the hardware store, the careful budgeting that stretched his firefighter's pension, and Sarah's life insurance just far enough to keep them afloat. Different people, different worlds, he said softly, more to himself than to his son. But as they drove home through the winding mountain roads, Daniel found himself thinking about the moment when Victoria's mask had slipped, when she'd looked at him not as a social inferior or a convenient rescuer, but as another parent who understood the terror of almost losing a child. In that instant, all the differences between them had fallen away, leaving only the fundamental human connection of shared experience and mutual understanding. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe helping someone did make you friends, regardless of the gulf between your circumstances. Or maybe it just made the gulf that much more obvious. Daniel tucked the business card into his shirt pocket and tried not to think about dark eyes and grateful smiles, or the way Victoria Hale had said his name like it meant something important. After all, what were the chances he'd ever see her again? The business card felt like it was burning a hole in Daniel's shirt pocket during the 3 days that followed their mountain rescue. He'd taken it out at least a dozen times, studying the elegant script and debating whether calling Victoria Hale would be appropriate or presumptuous. Each time he'd folded it carefully and put it away, telling himself that people like her didn't really want to hear from people like him once the crisis had passed. Wednesday morning found him at Murphy's Hardware restocking paint cans and trying to focus on the mundane rhythm of small-town commerce. The store smelled of sawdust and metal polish, familiar scents that usually brought him comfort. But today his mind kept drifting to dark eyes and the weight of an injured child on his back. "You've been jumpy as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs," observed Murphy himself, a grizzled man in his 70s who'd owned the store for 40 years. "Something eating at you, son." Daniel straightened a row of paintbrushes that didn't need straightening. "Just thinking about that rescue on Saturday. The one with the fancy helicopter." Murphy's weathered face creased into a knowing grin. "Word around town is you pulled some rich lady's kid out of a ravine. That true?" Small towns, Daniel reflected, were notorious for their inability to keep secrets. Her leg was broken. Couldn't leave her there. "Course not. That's not what I'm getting at." Murphy leaned against the counter, studying Daniel with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd seen human nature in all its forms. "Question is, what you gonna do about the thank you card burning a hole in your pocket?" Daniel looked up sharply. "How did you come? Boy, I've known you for 3 years. You've been patting that same spot on your shirt every 5 minutes like you're checking for a heartbeat." Murphy chuckled. "Plus, Ethel Morrison saw the whole thing from her kitchen window. Says the woman handed you something before she left in that fancy chopper." The gossip network in their small town was more efficient than any social media platform Daniel had learned. By now, half the population probably knew what he'd had for breakfast. "It's just a business card," Daniel said weakly. "Uh-huh. And I'm the Easter Bunny." Murphy's expression grew serious. "Listen, Daniel, I know you've been keeping to yourself since Sarah passed. Can't say I blame you. But isolating yourself isn't what she would have wanted, and it sure isn't what's best for that boy of yours." Before Daniel could respond, the bell above the store's entrance chimed, and Ethan burst through the door with the boundless energy of a child who'd just gotten out of school. "Dad, guess what happened today?" Ethan's backpack hit the floor with a thud as he launched into an animated recounting of his day. Mrs. Peterson said I could do my science project on mountain rescue techniques, and Tommy Williams asked if it was true that we saved someone's life, and Jessica Martinez said her dad knows about helicopters, and whoa there, speed racer, Daniel interrupted gently. Take a breath. Ethan grinned sheepishly. Sorry, I'm just excited. Can we go hiking again this weekend? Maybe we'll find someone else who needs help. Murphy laughed. This one's got the bug, doesn't he? Rescue fever, we used to call it back in my army days. Once you've helped someone in trouble, it gets in your blood. We're not going looking for people to rescue, Daniel said firmly. What we did was help someone who needed it. That's different. But if we found someone else, Ethan began. Then we'd help them too, Daniel finished. But we don't go looking for trouble, understood? Ethan nodded solemnly, then brightened again. Hey, Dad, did that lady ever call you? The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Daniel felt Murphy's knowing gaze and Ethan's curious eyes, and suddenly the business card in his pocket felt heavier than lead. No, buddy, she didn't call. But you could call her, right? She gave you her number. Out of the mouths of babes, Daniel thought. His 8-year-old son had cut straight to the heart of the matter, with the kind of simple logic that adults seem to lose somewhere along the way. It's complicated, Ethan. Why? Murphy was grinning now, clearly enjoying Daniel's discomfort. Yeah, Daniel, why is it complicated? Daniel shot his employer a withering look. Because she lives in a different world. Rich people don't really want to be friends with guys like me. How do you know? Ethan asked, with the persistence that made him such an effective 8-year-old prosecutor. Did you ask her? No, but... Then how do you know? Ethan pressed. Maybe she does want to be friends. Maybe Lily wants to be friends too. She seemed nice. Daniel found himself backed into a conversational corner by the relentless logic of childhood. In Ethan's world, if someone seemed nice and you'd helped them, the natural next step was friendship. Adult considerations like social class and economic disparity didn't factor into the equation. Tell you what, Murphy interjected, reaching behind the counter to pull out the store's cordless phone. Why don't you call her right now? Worst thing that happens is she's busy and can't talk. I'm not calling her from the hardware store, Daniel protested. Why not phone's a phone? Murphy held out the handset with the determined expression of someone who wasn't taking no for an answer. Besides, Ethan's right. You don't know what she wants unless you ask. Daniel looked between his son's hopeful face and Murphy's challenging grin and realized he was outnumbered. With a sigh that came from somewhere deep in his chest, he pulled out Victoria's business card and stared at the row of phone numbers printed beneath her name. Office mobile or direct line, he muttered. Mobile, Murphy advised. More personal. With trembling fingers that he hoped weren't visible, Daniel dialed the number. It rang twice before a cultured voice answered. Victoria Hale. Ms. Hale. This is Daniel Cross, from Saturday, the Mountain Rescue. There was a brief pause and Daniel's heart sank. She'd probably forgotten all about them, already moved on to more important matters in her undoubtedly busy life. Daniel. The warmth in her voice was unmistakable, and Daniel felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. I was hoping you'd call. How are you? How's Ethan? We're both fine. I wanted to check on Lily. How's her leg? Healing beautifully thanks to your quick thinking with that splint. The doctors said it could have been much worse if you hadn't stabilized it properly. Victoria's voice carried a note of professional respect. You really do know what you're doing. Daniel felt a flush of pride despite himself. 15 years as a firefighter teaches you a few things about trauma care. 15 years? That's impressive. Lily's been asking about you and Ethan constantly. She wants to know if she can thank you properly." Murphy was making exaggerated hand gestures and Ethan was practically bouncing with excitement. Daniel turned his back to them and lowered his voice. "That's not necessary. We were just glad we could help." "Actually, it is necessary. To us, anyway." Victoria's tone became more serious. "Daniel, what you did went far beyond basic human decency. You risked your own safety to save my daughter, and I'd like to find a way to show my appreciation that goes beyond a simple thank you card." Daniel's mouth went dry. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of, the rich lady trying to assuage her guilt with money or some other gesture that would make him feel like hired help rather than a human being who'd done what anyone would do. "Ms. Hale, I appreciate the thought, but we really don't need anything." "What if it's not about what you need?" Victoria interrupted gently. "What if it's about what Lily needs? She's been having nightmares about being trapped in that ravine. The only thing that helps is when she talks about you and Ethan coming to rescue her. She's convinced you're heroes." Daniel felt his resistance crumbling. He'd dealt with enough trauma victims to know how important it was for them to feel some sense of closure, some way of making meaning out of their experience. "What did you have in mind? Dinner? Nothing fancy, just the four of us? Lily could thank you in person, and maybe the adults could get to know each other a little better." Victoria paused. "I know we come from different backgrounds, Daniel, but we share something important now. We're both parents who would do anything to protect our children." The simple truth of that statement hit Daniel like a physical blow. Whatever differences existed between them, and there were many, Victoria was right about the fundamental connection they shared. "When?" he heard himself asking. "Are you free Saturday evening? I could cook, or we could go out, whatever you'd prefer." Daniel looked around the hardware store, taking in Murphy's encouraging nod, and Ethan's barely contained excitement. "Actually, why don't you come to our place? Nothing fancy, but I make a decent barbecue." "That sounds perfect. Should I bring anything?" "Just yourselves." Daniel rattled off his address, a description of the winding mountain road that led to their cabin, and his cell phone number in case they got lost. "We'll see you Saturday at 6. Victoria said, and Daniel could hear the smile in her voice. "And Daniel, thank you for everything." After he hung up, Daniel stood holding the phone for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. He'd just invited a billionaire to dinner at his modest mountain cabin. A woman who probably had her meals prepared by professional chefs was coming to eat his backyard barbecue. "Well," Murphy demanded, "don't keep us in suspense." "They're coming to dinner Saturday night," Daniel said, still somewhat stunned by his own boldness. Ethan let out a whoop of excitement that probably could be heard 3 counties over. "Really, Lily's coming here? This is going to be awesome." Murphy clapped Daniel on the shoulder with a hand that felt like a baseball mitt. "Good for you, son. Sarah would be proud." The mention of his late wife sent a familiar pang through Daniel's chest, but for once it wasn't entirely painful. Sarah had always been the social one in their relationship, the one who made friends easily and brought people together. Maybe inviting Victoria and Lily to dinner was something she would have done. The rest of the week passed in a blur of nervous preparation. Daniel found himself looking at his cabin through the eyes of someone accustomed to luxury, and he didn't like what he saw. The furniture was sturdy but worn, the kitchen was functional but tiny, and the whole place had the slightly shabby comfort of a home where a single father and his 8-year-old son lived without the moderating influence of feminine taste. Thursday evening found him at the grocery store agonizing over the meat selection, while Ethan offered unhelpful suggestions about what rich people might like to eat. "Maybe they only eat fancy stuff," Ethan said, examining a package of expensive steaks, "like caviar and lobsters and stuff you see on TV." They're people, Ethan, not aliens, Daniel replied, though privately he was having similar concerns. They eat the same food as everyone else. But what if they don't like barbecue? What if they're vegetarians? What if they're allergic to something? Daniel realized his own anxiety was feeding his son's worries. We'll cook what we know how to cook, and if they don't like it, we'll order pizza. The point isn't to impress them with fancy food, it's to say thank you for letting us help Lily. Friday was spent in a frenzy of cleaning that would have made Sarah laugh. Daniel scrubbed baseboards that hadn't been touched in months, organized closets that no one would see, and even washed windows that were already clean. Ethan threw himself into the effort with characteristic enthusiasm, though his idea of cleaning mostly involved moving his toys from one location to another. "Dad, should I hide my action figures?" Ethan asked, surveying his bedroom with the critical eye of someone preparing for a military inspection. "What if Lily thinks they're babyish?" "Lily is 10 years old, buddy. I don't think she's going to judge you for having toys. But what if she only likes girl stuff? What if she thinks our house is too small?" Daniel sat down on Ethan's bed and pulled his son onto his lap, recognizing the signs of pre-party anxiety that he was feeling himself. "Listen to me," he said gently. "Lily and her mom are coming here as our guests. That means they're grateful to be invited, not looking for reasons to criticize. And even if our house is different from what they're used to, that doesn't make it wrong or bad. It makes it ours." Ethan leaned against his father's chest, and Daniel could feel some of the tension leave the small body. "I just want them to like us." "They already like us, Ethan. That's why they're coming." Saturday dawned clear and warm, one of those perfect autumn days that made living in the Colorado mountains feel like a privilege rather than an exile. Daniel spent the morning preparing his marinade and checking his ancient gas grill for the third time, while Ethan bounced around the house like a ping-pong ball, too excited to focus on any single activity for more than 5 minutes. At 4 o'clock, Daniel sent his son outside to burn off some energy while he took a shower and tried to decide what to wear. His wardrobe wasn't exactly extensive work clothes, hiking gear, and a few items left over from his more social days with Sarah. He finally settled on dark jeans and a blue button-down shirt that Sarah had always said brought out his eyes. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, Daniel tried to see himself through Victoria's eyes. At 37, he was still in good shape from years of physical work and regular hiking, but the lines around his eyes spoke of stress and loss that had aged him beyond his years. His brown hair was starting to show threads of gray at the temples, and there was a gravity to his expression that hadn't been there before Sarah's death. He was ordinary, he realized. A perfectly ordinary man with an ordinary life in an ordinary small town. What could someone like Victoria Hale possibly find interesting about that? At 5:30, he heard the sound of an approaching car on the gravel road that led to their cabin. Daniel looked out the window and felt his stomach drop. Instead of the sleek black SUV he'd expected, Victoria was driving a modest silver sedan that looked like something a suburban soccer mom might own. Somehow, that made everything more complicated rather than less. Ethan was already running toward the car as Victoria and Lily climbed out, and Daniel took a moment to study them both. Victoria had traded her expensive outdoor gear for simple jeans and a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly grocery budget, but looked effortlessly casual. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and she moved with the same unconscious grace he remembered from their first meeting. Lily was on crutches, her injured leg in a bright blue cast that she'd apparently decorated with stickers and drawings. She looked pale but alert, and her face lit up when she saw Ethan racing toward them. "Ethan!" she called out, balancing carefully on her crutches. "Look what I got!" She gestured proudly to her cast, and Ethan skidded to a stop just short of knocking her over in his enthusiasm. Wow, does it hurt? Can I sign it? How long do you have to keep it on? 2 more weeks, and yes, you can totally sign it, Lily replied, grinning. I brought special markers. Daniel walked out to greet his guests, noting the way Victoria watched the interaction between the children with a smile that transformed her entire face. This was a different woman, from the composed executive he'd met on the mountain. This was a mother watching her child be happy and normal after a traumatic experience. Ms. Hale, he said, extending his hand. Welcome to our home. Victoria, please, she replied, her handshake firm and brief. And thank you for having us. Your place is beautiful. Daniel looked around at his modest property, the small log cabin with its wraparound porch, the towering pines that provided shade and privacy, the mountain views that stretched for miles in every direction. It was beautiful, he realized, just not in the way that money could buy. It's peaceful, he said simply. That's what drew us here after Sarah died. Victoria's expression softened. Lily mentioned that Ethan lost his mother. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. It's been 3 years, but some days it still feels fresh. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their children compare notes about the rescue and Lily's subsequent hospital experience. Ethan was signing her cast with the intense concentration he usually reserved for difficult math problems, while Lily provided a running commentary on all the other signatures and decorations. They seemed to be picking up where they left off, Victoria observed. Kids are resilient that way, Daniel replied. Adults make things more complicated than they need to be. Victoria glanced at him with something that might have been amusement. Speaking from experience, always. Daniel gestured toward the house. Can I offer you something to drink? I've got beer, wine, soda, or Sarah's famous sweet tea recipe. Sweet tea sounds perfect. It's been years since I've had proper Southern sweet tea. Sarah was from Georgia, Daniel explained as they walked toward the porch. She converted me to sweet tea and grits, among other things. The casual mention of his wife seemed to put Victoria at ease rather than creating awkwardness, and Daniel found himself relaxing as well. Maybe this wouldn't be as difficult as he'd feared. The next hour passed with surprising ease. Victoria proved to be an engaging conversationalist who seemed genuinely interested in their small-town life and Daniel's transition from firefighting to hardware retail. She asked thoughtful questions about Ethan's school and their hiking adventures, and she listened to the answers with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was actually absorbing the information rather than just being polite. Meanwhile, the children had established themselves on the living room floor with a collection of board games and art supplies, their chatter providing a cheerful soundtrack to the adult conversation. Lily's natural confidence seemed to bring out a more outgoing side of Ethan, and Daniel was amazed at how easily they'd fallen into friendship. Dinner should be ready in about 20 minutes, Daniel announced, checking his watch. I hope you're hungry. Starving, Victoria admitted. I haven't had a proper barbecue in ages. Most of my meals lately have been either hospital cafeteria food or whatever my assistant orders for board meetings. It was the first real glimpse she'd given him into her professional life, and Daniel found himself curious, despite his efforts to maintain appropriate boundaries. What exactly do you do? He asked. I recognized the company name, but I have to admit, I don't know much about the business world. Victoria's smile was rueful. I run a company that my father built. We started in outdoor recreation gear, clothing, that sort of thing, but we've diversified into hospitality and real estate development over the years. Luxury resorts mostly in places like Aspen and Jackson Hole. That sounds challenging, Daniel said, though privately he was trying to process the casual way she'd mentioned owning luxury resorts. It can be, especially lately. Victoria's expression darkened slightly. There's been talk about expanding into the Colorado market, which means a lot of travel and meetings and politics. It's taking me away from Lily more than I'd like. Is that why you were up here scouting locations? Partly, but mostly, we just needed to get away from the city for a while. Lily's been struggling since her father and I divorced last year, and I thought some time in the mountains might help. Victoria's voice carried a note of pain that made Daniel's chest tighten in sympathy. I never imagined our little getaway would turn into a medical emergency. How is she handling everything, the accident, I mean? Victoria glanced toward the living room where Lily was teaching Ethan some elaborate hand-clapping game with the patience of a natural teacher. Better now that she's met you two, she said quietly. She's been having nightmares, but they've gotten better since we planned this visit. I think she needed to see that you were real people, not just rescuers who appeared and disappeared. Daniel felt a familiar tightness in his throat. He'd never thought about the psychological impact of the rescue from Lily's perspective. But of course, a 10-year-old would need closure just as much as any adult trauma victim. We're glad she's okay, he said simply. Both of us. I know you are, and that means more to me than you realize. Victoria turned to face him fully, and Daniel was struck again by the intelligence and determination in her dark eyes. Daniel, can I ask you something personal? Sure. Why did you quit firefighting? You're obviously good at it, and it seems like something you cared about. The question caught him off guard, though he realized he should have expected it. Most people were curious about his career change, though few asked about it so directly. After Sarah died, I couldn't handle the unpredictability anymore, he said slowly. The long shifts, the emergency calls that could come at any time, the constant reminder that life could change in an instant. I needed something stable for Ethan's sake. That must have been a difficult decision. It was. Firefighting wasn't just my job, it was my identity. But being Ethan's father is more important than being a hero. Daniel looked toward his son, who was currently explaining the finer points of Monopoly to an apparently fascinated Lily. Some sacrifices are worth making. Victoria nodded slowly, and Daniel had the impression that she understood more about difficult choices than her privileged lifestyle might suggest. Dad, Ethan called from the living room. Is dinner ready yet? I'm starving, and Lily wants to try your famous barbecue sauce. Famous barbecue sauce? Victoria asked with raised eyebrows. Daniel felt his cheeks warm. Ethan has a tendency to exaggerate my culinary skills. I doubt that. You strike me as someone who's good at whatever he puts his mind to. The simple compliment hit Daniel harder than it should have. It had been a long time since anyone had expressed confidence in his abilities, and coming from someone as obviously accomplished as Victoria, it felt particularly meaningful. Well, he said, standing up and trying to ignore the way his pulse had quickened. I guess we'll find out. Dinner was served on the cabin's screened porch with a view of the mountains that was particularly spectacular in the golden light of evening. Daniel had worried that his simple meal, grilled chicken and vegetables, homemade potato salad, and fresh corn on the cob, would seem inadequate to someone accustomed to restaurant cuisine. But Victoria ate with obvious enjoyment, complimenting everything from his marinade recipe to the wild flowers Ethan had picked as a centerpiece. The conversation flowed as easily as the wine. Victoria had brought a bottle that probably cost more than Daniel usually spent on groceries in a week, but she presented it so casually that it didn't feel pretentious. They talked about everything from favorite hiking trails to childhood memories to the challenges of single parenthood, and Daniel found himself sharing stories and opinions that he usually kept private. So what's it really like living in a small town? Victoria asked as they lingered over dessert, store-bought ice cream that Ethan had insisted on serving in his mother's good bowls. Do you miss the city? Sometimes, Daniel admitted. Mostly, I miss the anonymity. In a place this small, everyone knows everyone else's business. It can feel suffocating when you're trying to grieve in private. But there are advantages too, right? Definitely. Ethan can ride his bike anywhere without me worrying about traffic or strangers. The schools are small enough that teachers actually know their students. And when someone needs help, the whole community rallies around them. Daniel glanced at his son, who was showing Lily his collection of interesting rocks from their various hikes. It's a good place to raise a child, even if it's not the most exciting place to be an adult. Excitement is overrated, Victoria said with feeling. Trust me on that. Speaking from experience, always. She smiled, echoing his earlier words. Sometimes I think Lily and I would be happier in a place like this. Somewhere we could just be ourselves without worrying about cameras or board meetings or social obligations. What's stopping you? Victoria's expression grew complicated. Responsibility, mainly. My company employs over 3,000 people, and my decisions affect their livelihoods. I can't just walk away because I'm tired of the pressure. But you can choose how to handle the pressure, Daniel said gently. I learned that the hard way. How do you mean? After Sarah died, I spent months trying to be the same person I'd always been just without her. It nearly broke me. It wasn't until I accepted that I needed to become someone new, someone who could handle this life, that things started to get better. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with an intensity that made him self-conscious. That's very wise, she said finally, and very brave. Not brave, just desperate. Sometimes they're the same thing. The conversation was interrupted by Lily's delighted laughter as Ethan performed some elaborate magic trick involving a disappearing quarter and a great deal of dramatic flourish. Watching them together, Daniel felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine or the pleasant evening air. They're good for each other, Victoria observed, following his gaze. Yeah, they are. Ethan doesn't have many friends his age around here. Most of the families with kids live closer to town. Lily doesn't have many friends at all, Victoria said quietly. Private school, constant travel security concerns. It doesn't leave much room for normal childhood friendships. Daniel heard the regret in her voice and felt a familiar pang of empathy. Different circumstances, same fundamental challenge, trying to give their children the best possible life while navigating limitations that were largely beyond their control. Maybe they can keep in touch, he suggested. Email, phone calls, that sort of thing. I'd like that. So would Lily. Victoria hesitated, then seemed to come to some internal decision. Actually, I was hoping we might see each other again before too long. Something in her tone made Daniel's pulse quicken. Oh, I'm going to be in the area fairly regularly over the next few months. The board is serious about this Colorado expansion, which means site visits and community meetings and all the tedious groundwork that goes into new development projects. Victoria's smile was slightly tentative. I was hoping you might be willing to show me around sometimes. Local perspective, hidden gems, that sort of thing. Daniel stared at her, trying to process what she was actually asking. Was this a business consultation, a friendly favor, or something else entirely? I'm not sure how much help I'd be with business stuff, he said carefully. I'm not talking about business. I'm talking about getting to know the area as a person, not an executive. Understanding what makes this place special to the people who live here. Victoria's eyes met his directly. Understanding what made you choose to build a life here. The simple honesty of her request caught Daniel off guard. He'd expected her to ask for tourist recommendations or business contacts, not for help understanding the soul of the place he'd chosen as his refuge. I'd be happy to show you around, he heard himself saying. Though I should warn you, my idea of hidden gems probably doesn't include five-star restaurants or luxury spas. Good. I get enough of those in my regular life. They were interrupted by Ethan's voice calling from the porch steps where he and Lily had migrated to examine the evening stars. "Dad, Victoria, come look at this. Lily found the Big Dipper." Daniel and Victoria joined the children on the steps, and for the next half hour, they took turns pointing out constellations and sharing stories about camping trips and wishes made on shooting stars. Lily proved to have an impressive knowledge of astronomy for a 10-year-old, while Ethan contributed creative mythologies for star patterns that existed only in his imagination. "Time for us to head back to the hotel," Victoria said, eventually glancing at her watch. "Lily needs her rest, and we have a long drive tomorrow." The children's protests were immediate and vocal, but both parents held firm. As they gathered Lily's crutches and the various art projects she'd accumulated during the evening, Daniel felt an unexpected reluctance to see them go. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," Victoria said as they stood beside her car. "This was exactly what we both needed. Thank you for coming, and for bringing the wine. I think it cost more than my truck is worth." Victoria laughed. "It's just wine, Daniel. Good wine, but still just wine." She leaned forward and kissed his cheek briefly, a gesture so natural and unexpected that he barely had time to register the soft warmth of her lips before she was stepping back. "Call me about those site visits," she said, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question. "I will," Daniel promised, meaning it. As they drove away, Daniel and Ethan stood in the driveway waving until the taillights disappeared around the bend. The evening air was cooling rapidly, carrying the crisp promise of autumn, and Daniel realized that for the first time in 3 years, he was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with his son's happiness, and everything to do with his own. "I like them," Ethan announced with characteristic 8-year-old directness. "Can they come back soon?" "Maybe." Daniel said, his hand finding the business card in his pocket once again. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden or an impossible dream. This time, it felt like a promise. 3 weeks passed before Victoria called and Daniel found himself checking his phone more often than he cared to admit. When her number finally appeared on his screen on a Tuesday morning, while he was restocking fishing tackle at Murphy's, he nearly dropped the entire display. "Daniel. It's Victoria. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Her voice carried that same warm professionalism he remembered, but there was something else underneath it, a note of genuine pleasure that made his chest tighten. "Not at all. Good to hear from you. How's Lily?" "Healing beautifully. The cast comes off next week and she's already planning her first hike back to Cascade Falls. To thank the mountain, she says." Victoria's laugh was soft and musical. "She's been asking about Ethan constantly. Are you free this weekend for that tour you promised?" Daniel glanced around the empty store, noting Murphy's exaggerated attempts to look busy, while obviously eavesdropping on every word. "Absolutely. What did you have in mind?" "I'm driving up Friday evening. I thought maybe Saturday we could explore some of those hidden gems you mentioned, and Sunday I could take you and Ethan somewhere. My treat." The offer was casual, but Daniel caught the underlying invitation. This wasn't just about business reconnaissance or showing gratitude. Victoria wanted to spend time with them. The realization sent a flutter of anticipation through his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "Sounds perfect. Should I pick somewhere touristy or off the beaten path?" "Surprise me." After they hung up, Daniel stood holding the phone for a long moment, aware of Murphy's knowing grin burning into the side of his head. "So," the older man said with exaggerated casualness, "got weekend plans. Victoria's coming back. She wants me to show her around." "Uh-huh." And how do you feel about that? Daniel considered the question seriously. How did he feel? Nervous, certainly. Excited in a way that felt both thrilling and slightly guilty. Confused about whether this was friendship business or something else entirely. Terrified, he admitted. Murphy's grin widened. Good. That means it matters. Friday evening found Daniel pacing his cabin like a caged animal, second-guessing every detail of the weekend he'd planned. He'd chosen the old mining ghost town of Silverton for Saturday's adventure, remote enough to have drawn crowds, historically interesting and spectacularly beautiful in the early autumn light. But now he worried it might be too rustic, too far off the grid, for someone accustomed to luxury accommodations. Ethan, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with excitement. He'd spent the afternoon creating an elaborate welcome sign covered in glitter and drawings of mountains, and he'd reorganized his rock collection 3 times to make sure it was worthy of Lily's inspection. What if she forgot about us? Ethan asked for the 5th time, pressing his nose against the living room window. What if she changed her mind? She didn't forget. Daniel assured him, though privately he was harboring similar fears. Rich people don't make promises they don't intend to keep. How do you know? I don't, Daniel admitted. But Victoria doesn't seem like the kind of person who says things she doesn't mean. The sound of tires on gravel sent Ethan racing to the door, and Daniel felt his pulse quicken as he watched the same silver sedan pull into their driveway. Victoria emerged wearing jeans and a soft gray sweater that somehow managed to look both casual and elegant, while Lily hopped out on her newly cast-free leg with the exuberance of someone who'd been restricted for too long. Ethan! Lily called out, immediately launching into an animated description of her physical therapy and the celebration ice cream she'd had when the cast was removed. Welcome back, Daniel said to Victoria, noting the way her face relaxed when she saw him. There were subtle signs of stress around her eyes that hadn't been there before, the telltale marks of someone dealing with significant pressure. Thank you for having us again. I can't tell you how much I needed this escape. Rough few weeks. Victoria's smile was rueful. The board is pushing hard for this Colorado expansion, which means constant meetings and conference calls and politicking. I sometimes wonder if they think I'm a machine rather than a person. You could always tell them no. Could I? Victoria's laugh held no humor. Sometimes I'm not sure anymore. The company has its own momentum, and I feel like I'm just trying to keep up rather than actually leading. Daniel heard the frustration in her voice and felt a familiar echo of his own struggles with expectations and obligations. That sounds exhausting. It is. But enough about my corporate drama. I'm here to not think about any of that for a whole weekend. Victoria's expression brightened as she watched their children examining Ethan's rock collection with the seriousness of museum curators. What adventures do you have planned for us? Ever been to a real ghost town? Only the touristy kind, with gift shops and guided tours. Then you're in for a treat. They left early Saturday morning, driving through mountain roads that grew progressively more remote as they climbed toward the old mining territory. Victoria had insisted on taking her car, claiming that Daniel deserved a break from chauffeuring duties, and he found himself studying her profile as she navigated the winding curves with surprising skill. You're a good driver, he observed. Survival skill. I learned to drive on mountain roads in Montana when I was visiting my grandfather's ranch. City driving is easy compared to avoiding elk at 6 in the morning. It was another small glimpse into her background that made her seem more human and less like the polished executive he'd initially met. Daniel found himself curious about those childhood visits to Montana, about the grandfather who'd apparently taught her to handle challenging terrain. In the back seat, Ethan and Lily were engaged in an elaborate game involving their respective collections of interesting objects, rocks, stickers, and what appeared to be a small arsenal of tiny toys that Lily had smuggled along, despite her mother's attempts to pack light. "Are you sure this place is safe?" Victoria asked, as they turned onto a dirt road that looked like it hadn't been maintained since the Carter administration. "Define safe," Daniel replied with a grin. "No active mining operations, no unstable structures we'll be going into, and no bears that I know of. Beyond that, adventure involves a certain amount of calculated risk." "Wonderful. My liability insurance is going to love this." But Victoria was smiling as she said it, and Daniel could see the tension leaving her shoulders as they climbed higher into the wilderness. Whatever stress she'd been carrying from her business life was being replaced by the kind of anticipation that came from heading into unknown territory. Silverton had been abandoned for nearly 70 years, but the mountain air had preserved it like a photograph frozen in time. Weather-beaten buildings lined what had once been the main street, their windows dark and their porches sagging, but their basic structures still sound. The surrounding peaks rose like cathedral spires, and the silence was so complete that their footsteps on the wooden boardwalks sounded like drumbeats. "This is incredible," Victoria breathed, turning in a slow circle to take in the panoramic view. "It's like stepping back in time." "The mine closed in 1952, Daniel explained, leading them toward the old general store. "Most of the families moved to Denver or Grand Junction, but some of the buildings were too well built to just fall down." Lily was already exploring with the fearless enthusiasm of a child who'd grown up in carefully controlled environments and relished the chance to experience something genuinely wooled. She peered through dusty windows, tested the stability of old fence posts, and peppered Daniel with questions about what life had been like for the children who'd lived here. "Were there really kids who lived this far from everything?" she asked, standing in what had once been the schoolhouse. "Families went where the work was," Daniel replied. "Mining was dangerous and hard, but it paid better than most jobs. These children probably knew more about surviving in the wilderness than kids today know about video games." "But didn't they get lonely?" It was Ethan who answered with the wisdom of someone who'd experienced isolation firsthand. "Maybe, but they had each other. And look at this place, how could you be sad when you can see forever?" Victoria caught Daniel's eye over the children's heads, and he saw his own pride reflected in her expression. Both their kids were processing this experience thoughtfully, drawing connections between past and present that most adults would miss. They spent the morning exploring with Daniel, providing historical context, and the children creating elaborate stories about the ghosts who might still inhabit the abandoned buildings. Victoria proved to be an enthusiastic participant, asking intelligent questions and demonstrating a genuine appreciation for the harsh beauty of the place. "It must have been incredibly difficult," she said, as they sat on the steps of the old church sharing the lunch they'd packed. "Building a life in a place this remote, never knowing if the mine would last or if winter would be survivable." "But they did it anyway," Daniel pointed out. "They came here with nothing but hope and determination, and they built something real, even if it didn't last. Maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that they tried, that they took the risk, and lived fully while they could." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel wondered if he'd said something wrong. Then she turned to look at him directly, and he saw something in her dark eyes that made his breath catch. "Is that what you're doing here, taking risks and living fully?" The question was more complex than it appeared on the surface, and Daniel found himself considering it seriously. Was he living fully, or was he just hiding from the complexities of a larger world? "I'm trying to," he said finally. "Some days are better than others. I envy you." "Envy me, you're the one with the successful company and the resources to do whatever you want." "Resources aren't the same as freedom," Victoria said quietly. You chose this life deliberately. I sometimes feel like my life chose me." Before Daniel could respond, Lily and Ethan came racing back from their exploration of the old mine entrance, full of excitement about the bat colony they'd discovered and the interesting minerals embedded in the rock walls. The moment of intimate conversation passed, but Daniel carried Victoria's words with him for the rest of the afternoon. The drive back was filled with the children's chatter about their adventure and their plans for the Sunday excursion Victoria had promised. But Daniel found himself stealing glances at Victoria, trying to reconcile the confident executive he'd first met with the woman who'd just admitted to feeling trapped by her own success. "Where are we going tomorrow?" Ethan asked as they pulled into the cabin's driveway. "Surprise?" Victoria replied mysteriously. "But dress warmly and bring your sense of adventure." That evening, after a simple dinner on the porch and an elaborate game of charades that left all four of them laughing until their sides hurt Daniel, and Victoria found themselves alone on the front steps while the children played video games inside. "Thank you for today," Victoria said, pulling her sweater tighter against the cooling air. "I can't remember the last time I spent an entire day without checking my phone or thinking about business obligations." "Did you miss it?" "The business god, no. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again, instead of just a job title." Daniel studied her profile in the dim light from the porch. "What's yourself like?" Victoria's laugh was soft and slightly self-conscious. "I'm not sure anymore. I used to know before the divorce and the pressure to prove myself and all the expectations about what a female CEO should be. Somewhere along the way, I lost track of Victoria, the person." "She's still there," Daniel said gently. "I've seen her. She's the one who taught Lily to identify constellations and who asked thoughtful questions about mining families and who laughs at 8-year-old jokes about ghost chickens." Ghost chickens. Ethan's contribution to the ghost town mythology. Apparently, the spirits of departed poultry are a serious concern in abandoned mining camps. Victoria's laughter was warm and genuine, and Daniel felt something shift in the space between them. This wasn't just friendship or gratitude anymore. This was the beginning of something more complex and potentially more dangerous. "Daniel," Victoria said, her voice suddenly serious, "can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot." "Do you ever think about dating again? Moving on from Sarah?" The question hit him like a physical blow, not because it was offensive, but because it cut straight to the heart of something he'd been avoiding thinking about. "Sometimes," he admitted, "more lately than before." "What stops you?" Daniel considered the question seriously. What did stop him? Fear of betraying Sarah's memory, concern about introducing complications into Ethan's life, or something deeper and more fundamental about his own worthiness? "I'm not sure I know how to be with someone else," he said finally. "Sarah and I grew up together. We learned how to be adults together, how to be partners. I don't know how to start over with someone new, especially someone who didn't know me before." "Know you before what?" "Before I became this version of myself. The widowed single father with the modest life and the small ambitions. Sarah knew me when I had bigger dreams, when I thought I could save everyone and fix everything. I'm not that person anymore." Victoria was quiet for so long that Daniel began to worry he'd revealed too much. Then she reached over and covered his hand with hers, a gesture so natural and comforting that he felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "Maybe you don't need to be that person," she said softly. "Maybe the person you are now is exactly who you're supposed to be." Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of crystal blue sky that made the Colorado mountains look like a postcard. Victoria arrived early, bearing coffee from the town's only decent cafe, and a mysterious gleam in her eyes that made both Daniel and Ethan immediately suspicious. "Okay, what's the surprise?" Ethan demanded, bouncing on his toes with excitement. "Hot air balloon ride," Victoria announced, grinning at their shocked expressions. "I booked us a sunrise flight over the valley." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "A what now?" "You said you wanted adventure." Victoria reminded him, clearly enjoying his discomfort. "This qualifies." "I was thinking more along the lines of a challenging hike or maybe whitewater rafting. Something with solid ground underneath." "Don't tell me the big brave firefighter is afraid of heights," Lily teased, finally getting her revenge for all the gentle ribbing she'd endured about her mountain rescue. "Not afraid," Daniel protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just cautious about unnecessary risks." "Dad, it'll be awesome," Ethan exclaimed, already imagining himself floating among the clouds. "We'll be able to see everything from up there." Victoria's expression softened as she watched Daniel's internal struggle. "We don't have to go if you're really uncomfortable. I can cancel the reservation." But Daniel could see the disappointment that Ethan was trying to hide, and he thought about his conversation with Victoria the night before, about taking risks and living fully. When was the last time he'd done something that truly challenged him, something that pushed him beyond his carefully constructed comfort zone? "No," he said, finally surprising himself with his decision. "Let's do it. But if I die of a heart attack up there, I'm blaming you." The balloon launch site was a meadow just outside town, where a crew was already inflating a massive red and gold envelope that looked impossibly large against the morning sky. The pilot, a weathered man in his 60s named Joe, explained the safety procedures with the casual competence of someone who'd done this thousands of times. "First time?" he asked Daniel, noting his nervous expression. "Yeah, and hopefully the last." Joe laughed. "That's what they all say. Then they want to book another flight before we even land." The basket was smaller than Daniel had expected, designed to hold the four of them, plus Joe, in what would be decidedly close quarters. As they climbed aboard, Daniel found himself standing next to Victoria, close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume and feel the warmth radiating from her body. "You okay?" she asked quietly, noting his white-knuckled grip on the basket's edge. "Ask me when we're back on the ground." The ascent was surprisingly gentle, a gradual lifting that felt more like being on a very slow elevator than the terrifying launch Daniel had imagined. As they rose above the tree line, the world spread out below them in a panorama that took his breath away for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "Oh my God," Victoria whispered, her hand finding his arm. "Look at that." The valley stretched out beneath them like a living map, with their small town nestled among the pines like a collection of toy buildings. The morning sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and amber, and the silence was so profound that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat. "This is incredible," Lily breathed, her face pressed against the side of the basket. "We're flying. We're actually flying." Ethan was equally mesmerized, pointing out landmarks and asking Joe a rapid-fire series of questions about how balloons worked and whether they ever saw wildlife from this altitude. His excitement was infectious, and Daniel felt his anxiety gradually giving way to wonder. "Thank you," he said to Victoria, meaning it. I can't even describe it." "You don't have to," she replied, her dark eyes reflecting the golden light of sunrise. "Some experiences are beyond words." They drifted over the landscape for nearly an hour, with Joe providing a running commentary about the geography and local history. They passed over the ghost town they'd explored the day before, seeing it from an entirely different perspective that revealed the full scope of the mining operation and the challenging terrain the early settlers had chosen to call home. Makes you appreciate what they went through, Victoria observed, watching the shadow of their balloon move across the mountainside like a gentle giant. And what we have now, Daniel added, the luxury of choosing adventure instead of having it forced on us by necessity. As they began their descent toward the landing site, Daniel realized that something fundamental had shifted during their flight. The fear he'd felt at the beginning had been replaced by a sense of possibility, a reminder that life still held surprises and experiences worth pursuing, despite the losses and disappointments of the past. The landing was surprisingly smooth, with the ground crew appearing, as if by magic, to help secure the balloon and pack the equipment. As they climbed out of the basket, Daniel felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Relief to be safely back on solid ground, but disappointment that the experience was over. "So," Joe said with a knowing grin, "ready to book your next flight?" Daniel looked at Victoria, who was watching him with an expression of amused expectation, then at the children, who were already planning their next aerial adventure with the boundless enthusiasm of youth. "Maybe," he admitted, surprising himself. "Yeah, maybe I am." The drive back to the cabin was filled with excited chatter about their bird's-eye view of the world and plans for future adventures. But Daniel found himself focusing on the weight of Victoria's hand on his arm during the most spectacular moments of the flight, the way her face had lit up with pure joy as they soared above the mountains. "Dad, that was the best thing ever," Ethan declared as they pulled into the driveway. "Can we do it again next weekend?" "Let's see how our bank account feels about that idea," Daniel replied, though privately he was already wondering how he could afford to give his son more experiences like this one. "What if I paid?" Victoria began, but Daniel cut her off with a gentle shake of his head. "Thank you, but no. If we do this again, we do it ourselves." Victoria looked like she wanted to argue, but something in his expression must have convinced her to let it go. "Fair enough. But the offer stands whenever you're ready." As they unloaded their gear and prepared to say goodbye, Daniel felt the familiar reluctance that seemed to accompany the end of their visits. These weekends were becoming something he looked forward to in a way that went beyond simple friendship or gratitude, and the thought of returning to the routine of his ordinary life felt suddenly claustrophobic. "When will we see you again?" Ethan asked Lily as they exchanged elaborate handshakes and promises to write emails. "Soon," Victoria answered before her daughter could respond. "I'll be back in 2 weeks for those site meetings I mentioned. Maybe we can do something less death-defying next time." "Hey, we all survived," Daniel protested. "Even enjoyed it, if I'm being honest." "You did more than survive," Victoria said quietly, stepping closer as the children wandered toward the porch to examine Ethan's latest rock acquisitions. "You faced something that scared you and came out stronger for it. That takes courage. Or stupidity. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. I think I'm learning that courage and stupidity are often the same thing, just viewed from different angles." Victoria's smile was soft and slightly sad. "Thank you for this weekend, Daniel, for showing me that there are still places in the world where time moves differently, where people matter more than profits. Thank you for reminding me that there are still adventures worth having." They stood facing each other in the golden afternoon light, and Daniel felt something electric pass between them, a recognition of possibilities that neither was quite ready to name. Then Lily called out that she was ready to go, and the moment passed, but its echo lingered in the space between them. As Victoria's car disappeared around the bend in the road, Daniel stood in his driveway, with Ethan's hand in his, watching, until the taillights vanished completely. The silence that followed felt different from the usual quiet of their mountain refuge. It felt expectant, as if the very air was holding its breath for something that was coming. "Dad," Ethan said after a long moment. Do you like Victoria? The question was simple, but Daniel knew his answer would be anything but. Did he like Victoria? Yes, more than was probably wise. Was he developing feelings that went beyond friendship? Almost certainly. Was he ready to deal with the implications of that reality? Yeah, buddy, he said finally. I like her a lot. Good, Ethan said with satisfaction. Because I think she likes you too. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Daniel sat on his porch steps and looked up at the stars that had become his companions during the long evenings of widowhood. For 3 years, this view had been enough: the constancy of the mountains, the reliable cycle of seasons, the predictable rhythm of small-town life. But now, for the first time since Sarah's death, he found himself wanting something more. The business card in his pocket no longer felt like a weight or an impossibility. Now it felt like a bridge to a future he hadn't dared to imagine, a connection to someone who saw him not as a project to be fixed or a charity case to be helped, but as a man worth knowing in his own right. 2 weeks suddenly seemed like a very long time to wait. The 2 weeks passed with agonizing slowness each day, stretching like taffy in Daniel's mind as he found himself counting down to Victoria's return. He caught himself checking his phone obsessively, hoping for a call or text that would bridge the growing distance he felt from their last conversation. When her number finally appeared on his screen on a Thursday evening, his heart jumped in a way that made him feel like a teenager again. Daniel, I hope I'm not calling too late. Not at all. Good to hear from you. He settled into his porch chair, noting the exhaustion in her voice. How are the site meetings going? Victoria's sigh was audible across the connection. More complicated than I expected. The local zoning board is resistant to our proposals, and there are some environmental concerns that weren't in the initial reports. I'm starting to wonder if this expansion is worth the headache. What kind of environmental concerns? Watershed issues mainly. The sites the board wants to develop are close to some pristine alpine lakes, and there's a coalition of local groups raising questions about impact studies. Victoria paused, and Daniel could hear the sound of papers rustling. I find myself agreeing with them more than I probably should, as the CEO of the company, trying to build there. Daniel felt a surge of respect for her honesty. That must put you in a difficult position. You could say that. The board sees dollar signs and market opportunities. I see the places you've shown me, the ghost towns and untouched wilderness that make this area special. It's hard to reconcile the two perspectives. Maybe they don't need to be reconciled. Maybe you need to choose. The silence that followed was long enough that Daniel began to worry he'd overstepped. Then Victoria's voice came back softer and more thoughtful than before. I've been thinking about that conversation we had about courage and stupidity being the same thing viewed from different angles. I'm starting to think I've been viewing my situation from the wrong angle for a long time. How so? I've been so focused on proving I could run my father's company as well as he did that I forgot to ask whether I should run it the way he did. Whether the decisions that made sense for him make sense for me. Daniel heard something in her voice that reminded him of his own crisis 3 years ago, when he'd had to choose between continuing his firefighting career and creating a stable life for Ethan. The weight of expectations versus the pull of personal truth. What would make sense for you? I don't know yet, but I'm hoping to figure it out this weekend. Are you free Saturday? I thought maybe we could hike somewhere remote, somewhere I can think clearly, without board members and lawyers and environmental impact specialists breathing down my neck. Of course. I know just the place. And Daniel, could it be just us this time? I love the kids, but I need some space to process everything that's happening. The request sent a flutter of nervous anticipation through Daniel's chest. A day alone with Victoria, away from the comfortable buffer of their children's presence, felt like stepping into uncharted territory. "I'll ask Murphy if Ethan can help out at the store on Saturday. He's been wanting to earn some spending money anyway." "Perfect. I'll pick you up at 8. After they hung up, Daniel sat on his porch for a long time, staring up at the star-filled sky and trying to understand what was happening to him. For 3 years, his world had been carefully contained: work, Ethan, their small mountain community, the predictable rhythm of healing and moving forward. Now Victoria had appeared like a comet in that carefully ordered universe, beautiful and chaotic, and impossible to ignore. Friday evening found him standing in front of his bathroom mirror, trying to decide what to wear for a hike with a billionaire CEO who was questioning everything about her life. He settled on his most respectable hiking gear and tried not to think too hard about why her opinion of his appearance suddenly mattered so much. "Dad, you're being weird again," Ethan observed from the doorway, watching his father check his reflection for the 3rd time. "I'm not being weird. I'm being prepared. For a hike? For a complicated hike." Ethan considered this with the seriousness he brought to all adult mysteries. "Is Victoria sad about something?" The question caught Daniel off guard with its perceptiveness. "Why do you ask?" She sounded different on the phone. Tired, but not regular tired. Worried tired. Daniel crouched down to his son's eye level, struck once again by how much Ethan absorbed despite his youth. "She's dealing with some difficult decisions at work. Sometimes adults have to make choices that don't have easy answers. Like when you decided to stop being a firefighter." "Yeah, like that." Ethan nodded solemnly. "Will you help her figure it out?" "I'll try. But some things people have to figure out for themselves. But it's easier when you have friends to help, right?" Out of the mouths of babes, Daniel thought. Right. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, with low clouds clinging to the mountain peaks like smoke. Victoria pulled into the driveway precisely at 8, driving the same silver sedan, but looking somehow different, less polished, more vulnerable. She was wearing jeans and a fleece jacket, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and Daniel could see the stress of the past weeks in the tight lines around her eyes. "You look like you need this hike," he said, as he climbed into the passenger seat. "You have no idea. I've spent the last 3 days in conference rooms with men in expensive suits arguing about profit margins and market penetration, while completely ignoring the fact that we're talking about destroying some of the most beautiful landscape in North America." Daniel directed her toward the trailhead for Cathedral Lake, a remote alpine destination that required a steep 5-mile climb, but rewarded hikers with views that could reset a person's entire perspective on life. As they drove through the winding mountain roads, Victoria gradually began to relax, her shoulders dropping and her grip on the steering wheel loosening. "Tell me about this place we're going," she said, as they climbed higher into the wilderness. Cathedral Lake sits at about 11,000 feet, surrounded by peaks that look like Gothic spires. It's one of those places that makes you understand why people used to think mountains were sacred. "How often do you go there?" "Not often enough. It's a challenging hike, and I usually can't convince Ethan to tackle something that steep. But it's where I go when I need to remember what really matters." Victoria glanced at him curiously. "When was the last time you needed that kind of reminder?" "The day I decided to quit firefighting. I hiked up there and sat by the lake for about 6 hours trying to figure out who I was supposed to be if I wasn't the guy who ran into burning buildings." "What did you figure out?" "That identity is more flexible than I thought. That who I am isn't the same as what I do for a living." Daniel looked out at the passing landscape, remembering that day of crisis and clarity. that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you need to change course. They parked at the trailhead and shouldered their day packs, beginning the steep ascent through dense forest that gradually gave way to alpine meadows and rocky outcroppings. Victoria proved to be a strong hiker, maintaining a steady pace despite the altitude and the weight of whatever internal struggles she was carrying. For the first hour, they hiked mostly in silence, both of them absorbed in the rhythm of placing one foot in front of the other and the gradual process of leaving the complicated world behind. It wasn't until they stopped for water at a scenic overlook that Victoria finally opened up about what was really troubling her. "The Environmental Coalition isn't wrong," she said, staring out at the vast wilderness spread below them. "The sites we're looking at are incredibly fragile ecosystems. Building luxury resorts there would fundamentally alter the character of this entire region. But your board doesn't see it that way. The board sees market research showing that wealthy tourists will pay premium prices for authentic mountain experiences. They see profit projections and competitive advantages and shareholder value." Victoria's voice carried a bitter edge. "They don't see what we're seeing right now." Daniel followed her gaze across the pristine landscape, trying to imagine it dotted with five-star hotels and golf courses, and whatever other amenities catered to people who needed their wilderness experiences sanitized and convenient. "What do you see when you look at this?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the gray sky. "I see my grandfather's ranch in Montana. I see the summers I spent there as a kid learning to ride horses and fish in streams that were so clear you could see the bottom 20 feet down. I see everything I've been trying to get back to my entire adult life." What happened to the ranch? Development happened. A resort company made my grandfather an offer he couldn't refuse, financially speaking. Within 5 years, the place I'd loved more than anywhere else on earth was gone, replaced by a luxury spa and conference center that could have been anywhere. Victoria's smile was sad and self-aware. "The irony is that my father used the profits from that sale to expand our company into the hospitality business. I've been benefiting from that destruction my entire career." Daniel felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. Victoria's conflict wasn't just about business ethics or environmental responsibility. It was about confronting the foundations of her own success. "Is that why you're really questioning this expansion?" "Partly, but it's more than that." Victoria shouldered her pack, and they resumed climbing the trail, growing steeper and more challenging. "I've been asking myself what kind of legacy I want to leave for Lily. Do I want her to inherit a company that makes money by consuming beautiful places? Or do I want to show her that sometimes the right choice is also the harder choice?" They climbed in contemplative silence for another hour, the trail switchbacking up a rocky face that required all their concentration and breath. When they finally crested the final ridge and Cathedral Lake spread out before them, Victoria stopped so abruptly that Daniel nearly walked into her. "Oh my God," she whispered. The lake was a perfect mirror of dark blue water, reflecting the towering granite spires that surrounded it like the pillars of some ancient temple. The silence was absolute, except for the whisper of wind across stone, and the thin air at 11,000 feet made every breath feel precious and deliberate. "Now I understand why you come here to think," Victoria said, settling onto a flat boulder beside the water. "It's impossible to worry about quarterly earnings in a place like this." Daniel sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body in the cool mountain air. "Sarah and I came here on our last hiking trip together, about a month before she was diagnosed. We sat right here and made plans for Ethan's future, for trips we were going to take, and dreams we were going to chase. That must be painful coming back here. It was the first time, but now it feels more like continuity. Like the best parts of what we had are still here, still accessible. Daniel picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in his hands. I think she would have liked you. Victoria looked at him with surprise. Really, why? Because you ask the hard questions. Because you care more about doing the right thing than the easy thing. Because you make Lily laugh, and you're not afraid to let Ethan teach you about rocks and ghost chickens. Daniel met her eyes directly. Because you make me remember what it feels like to want something beyond just getting through each day. The admission hung in the thin air between them, more vulnerable than Daniel had intended to be. Victoria's expression grew soft and serious, and he could see her processing his words with the same careful attention she'd given to every moment of their developing friendship. Daniel, she said quietly, I need you to know that whatever's happening between us, it's not just gratitude or loneliness or some kind of rebound from my divorce. What I feel for you is something I haven't felt in years, maybe ever. What do you feel? Victoria turned to face him fully, her dark eyes reflecting the granite peaks around them. Safe. Seen. Like I can be myself instead of performing the role of Victoria Hale, CEO. When I'm with you, I remember who I was before all the pressure and expectations and responsibilities. I remember what it felt like to have dreams that weren't measured in market share and profit margins. Daniel felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Victoria. I know it's complicated, she continued before he could finish the thought. I know we come from different worlds, different circumstances. I know there are 1,000 practical reasons why this doesn't make sense. But sitting here in this place that means so much to you, I can't bring myself to care about practical reasons. I care about the way you look at your son, the way you took care of Lily without even thinking about it, the way you've built a life based on what matters instead of what pays. Victoria's voice grew stronger, more certain. I care about the way you make me want to be a better person. Daniel reached out and took her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his. You're already a better person than you give yourself credit for. The fact that you're questioning this expansion, that you're willing to potentially sacrifice profits for principles that takes courage. Or stupidity. Same thing, different angle. Daniel reminded her, echoing their earlier conversation. They sat by the lake for hours, talking about everything from childhood dreams to present fears to the uncertain future that stretched ahead of them both. Victoria shared stories about growing up in the shadow of her father's expectations, about a marriage that had been more business partnership than love affair, about the loneliness of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Daniel talked about the guilt he still carried over Sarah's death, about his fears of failing Ethan, about the strange combination of peace and restlessness that defined his mountain exile. As the afternoon wore on and the clouds began to clear, revealing patches of brilliant blue sky between the granite peaks, Daniel found himself falling, not just for Victoria's beauty or intelligence or success, but for the woman she was when all the external trappings fell away. This was Victoria at her core, thoughtful, passionate, torn between duty and desire, trying to find a path that honored both her responsibilities and her values. I have a confession, Victoria said, as they began the long descent back toward the trailhead. I didn't come here just for the site meetings. No. I came because I needed to see you again. Because I've been thinking about you constantly since our balloon ride, and I couldn't concentrate on anything else until I figured out what that meant. Daniel felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of hiking. And what do you think it means? I think it means I'm falling in love with you, Victoria said simply. And that terrifies me more than any board meeting or business decision I've ever faced. They stopped walking, standing in the middle of the trail, with the vast wilderness spread around them, and the weight of her admission settling between them like fresh snow. "Why does it terrify you?" Daniel asked gently. "Because I don't know how to balance what I feel for you with everything else in my life. Because caring about someone this much gives them the power to hurt you in ways that bankruptcy and divorce and corporate failure never could." Victoria's voice grew quiet. "Because I've never wanted anything as much as I want this to work, and that makes me feel completely out of control." Daniel stepped closer, reaching up to cup her face in his hands. "Maybe being out of control isn't always a bad thing," says the man who quit a dangerous job to create stability for his son. Says the man who just spent the day falling in love with a woman whose life is the exact opposite of stable. Daniel smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Maybe we're both due for a little chaos." Victoria's answering smile was radiant. "Maybe we are." When Daniel leaned down to kiss her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as inevitable as sunrise over the mountains, as necessary as breathing the thin alpine air. Her lips were soft and warm, and when she kissed him back with a passion that spoke of months of suppressed longing, he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what was possible. They broke apart slowly, foreheads touching, breathing the same air in the vast silence of the wilderness. "What happens now?" Victoria whispered. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "But I think that's okay. I think maybe the best things happen when you stop planning and start living." The hike back to the car passed in a comfortable bubble of new intimacy, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just shifted between them. They held hands when the trail was wide enough, stolen glances when it wasn't, and talked about everything except the practical implications of what they'd just acknowledged. It wasn't until they were driving back toward town that reality began to creep back in around the edges of their mountain sanctuary. "Daniel," Victoria said, as they descended through the foothills, "there's something else I need to tell you. Something about why I really came back this weekend." The seriousness in her tone made Daniel's stomach clench. "Okay." "The board is meeting on Monday to make a final decision about the Colorado expansion. They want me to present a recommendation about whether to move forward with the original sites or look for alternatives." "What are you going to recommend?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I'm going to recommend that we abandon the project entirely. Not just the specific sites, but the whole idea of expanding into Colorado." Daniel stared at her, trying to process the implications of what she was saying. "Victoria, that's a huge decision. What will the board say? They'll be furious. They'll question my judgment, my commitment to the company, maybe even my competence as a CEO." Victoria's smile was rueful but determined. "They might try to force me out. And you're willing to risk that?" "I'm willing to risk that for the right reasons. For places like Cathedral Lake, for communities like yours, that deserve protection from people like me." Victoria glanced at him, and Daniel saw a strength in her expression that reminded him why he'd been drawn to her from the very beginning. But also for more personal reasons, such as wanting to be the kind of person you could be proud to be with, such as wanting to show Lily that success isn't just about money and power, but about making choices you can live with. Victoria's voice grew softer. "Such as wanting to build a life that has room for love instead of just ambition." Daniel felt his heart swell with admiration and something deeper, a recognition that this woman was not just beautiful and intelligent and successful, but genuinely courageous in ways that mattered. "What will you do if they force you out?" "I have no idea," Victoria admitted with a laugh, that was part terror and part exhilaration. For the first time in my adult life, I have absolutely no plan beyond doing what feels right and hoping it works out. That's terrifying and liberating. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, both of them lost in thought about the enormity of what lay ahead. When Victoria pulled into Daniel's driveway, they sat for a moment in the gathering dusk, reluctant to break the spell of the day. "Whatever happens on Monday," Daniel said finally, "you're making the right choice." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've watched you struggle with this decision, and I've seen how much it costs you to even consider compromising your values for business reasons. That's not who you are, Victoria. You're someone who saves her daughter from making the same mistakes she made, someone who cares more about legacy than profit." Victoria leaned across the console and kissed him softly. "Thank you for helping me remember that. Thank you for letting me." As Daniel walked toward his cabin, he could see Ethan's face pressed against the living room window, clearly bursting with curiosity about how the day had gone. But before dealing with his son's inevitable questions, he turned back to watch Victoria drive away, her taillights disappearing around the familiar bend. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he was standing at the beginning of something rather than the end. Whatever complications lay ahead, and there would undoubtedly be many, he was ready to face them. He was ready to take the risk of loving someone again, ready to see where this impossible connection might lead. Monday suddenly seemed very far away and very important. Whatever Victoria decided to tell her board would set the course for both their futures, and Daniel found himself hoping with an intensity that surprised him that she would find the courage to choose love over security, principles over profit. After all, some things were worth the risk of losing everything. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a storm has passed. Though Daniel suspected the real storm was just beginning. He'd barely slept, his mind cycling through every possible outcome of Victoria's board meeting and what each might mean for their fragile new relationship. When his phone rang at 7:30, his heart nearly stopped. "Daniel, it's over." Victoria's voice was steady, but he could hear something underneath it. Relief mixed with terror, liberation tangled with loss. "What happened?" "I presented my recommendation to abandon the Colorado expansion entirely. I told them about the environmental concerns, the community resistance, the long-term reputational risks." Victoria paused, and Daniel could hear the sound of traffic in the background. "And then I told them about my concerns as a person, not just as a CEO." "How did they take it?" "About as well as you'd expect. 3 hours of arguments, accusations that I'd lost my objectivity, suggestions that I was suffering from some kind of emotional breakdown." Victoria's laugh was hollow. "Richard Pemberton actually asked if I was having a midlife crisis." Daniel felt a surge of protective anger. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that maybe a midlife crisis was exactly what I needed. That maybe spending my whole life making decisions based on other people's expectations had been the real mistake." Victoria's voice grew stronger. "And then I resigned." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. "You what?" "I quit, Daniel, effective immediately. I walked out of that boardroom and I'm never going back." "Victoria, are you sure about this? That company is your entire life." "No," Victoria said firmly. "That company was my entire prison. There's a difference." Daniel could hear the conviction in her voice, but also the underlying tremor of someone who'd just jumped off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. "Where are you now?" "Driving toward you. I know it's Monday morning, and you have work, but I needed to tell you in person. I needed to see your face when I tell you that I choose us, Daniel. I choose this life, this possibility, over everything I'm leaving behind." The cabin suddenly felt too small to contain the emotions surging through Daniel's chest. "I'll call Murphy, tell him I need the day off. Come home, Victoria." The word home hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them had fully processed yet. But it felt right natural, like something that had been true long before either of them had the courage to acknowledge it. An hour later, Victoria stood in Daniel's living room, looking like a woman who'd just walked out of one life and into another. She was still wearing the expensive business suit she'd put on for the board meeting, but her hair was windblown, and her eyes held a wild brightness that spoke of bridges burned and futures uncertain. "Tell me everything," Daniel said, pulling her into his arms. "There's not much to tell. I said my piece, they said theirs, and we reached what diplomats would call an irreconcilable difference of opinion." Victoria melted against him, and Daniel could feel some of the tension leaving her body. "Richard offered me a 6-month sabbatical to reconsider my position, which was corporate speak for time to come to your senses and stop embarrassing us. But you turned it down." "I turned it down. I told them that some decisions can't be undone, that some lines can't be uncrossed." Victoria pulled back to look at him directly. "I told them I was choosing love over profit, and that if they couldn't understand that choice, then I was working for the wrong company." Daniel studied her face, looking for signs of regret or second thoughts. Instead, he saw a woman who looked lighter, freer, despite having just walked away from everything she'd worked for her entire adult life. "Do you regret it?" "Ask me in a year when I'm figuring out how to pay Lily's tuition without a CEO salary," Victoria said with a shaky laugh. "But right now I feel like I can breathe for the first time in decades." "What will you do?" "I have no idea, and that's the most terrifying and exhilarating thing I've ever said." Victoria moved to the window, looking out at the mountain vista that had become such an important part of both their stories. "I have savings investments enough to keep us comfortable while I figure out what comes next. Maybe I'll start something new, something smaller and more sustainable. Maybe I'll go back to school, get that environmental science degree I always wanted. Maybe I'll just be Lily's mom for a while and figure out the rest as I go." "You could stay here," Daniel said quietly. "Both of you. There's plenty of room, and Ethan would love having Lily around full-time." Victoria turned from the window, her dark eyes wide with surprise. "Daniel, are you asking me to move in with you?" The question hung in the air between them, enormous and immediate. Was he? 3 days ago, he'd been a widowed single father, living a carefully controlled life in a small mountain town. Now he was apparently ready to open that life to a woman and her daughter, to remake everything he'd built in the aftermath of loss. "I'm asking you to consider it," he said carefully. "I'm asking you to think about whether what we have is worth building something real around. What about the practical considerations, the logistics? I'm still technically a Colorado resident, but all my legal affairs are tied up in New York. Lily's school, her friends, her father's visitation rights." "We'll figure it out," Daniel interrupted gently. "People relocate across the country all the time. Kids adapt, legal issues get resolved, new schools become old schools. The logistics are just details, Victoria. The question is whether you want to try." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel could practically see her mental wheels turning as she calculated costs and benefits, weighed risks against possibilities. Then she smiled, and it was like watching the sun come out from behind clouds. "I want to try," she said simply. "God help me, I want to try everything with you." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and logistics as Victoria began the complex process of untangling her New York life and preparing for what might become a permanent relocation to Colorado. Daniel listened to her navigate conversations with lawyers, accountants, and Lily's school, marveling at the efficiency with which she could dismantle a corporate existence while simultaneously laying the groundwork for something entirely different. "The house in Westchester will have to be sold," she said during a break between calls. "But that's probably for the best anyway. It always felt more like a museum than a home." "What about Lily? How do you think she'll handle such a big change?" Victoria's expression grew thoughtful. "Better than I expected, I think. She's been struggling in her current school, too much pressure, too many kids who see her as just the rich girl. And she's talked constantly about Ethan and your mountain adventures since that first weekend. I think she's ready for something different, too." "When will you tell her?" "Tonight. I'm driving back to get her from her father's apartment, and then we're coming back up here for the rest of the week. I figure if we're going to make this transition, we should start immediately." The thought of Victoria and Lily returning so soon, not as weekend visitors, but as potential permanent residents, sent a thrill of anticipation through Daniel's chest. "I should warn you, Ethan's going to be over the moon. He's been asking when Lily was coming back every day since your last visit." "Good. I want them both to be excited about this. I want this to feel like an adventure, not an obligation." That afternoon, while Victoria drove back to Denver to collect Lily and explain their new circumstances, Daniel found himself walking through his cabin with fresh eyes. The space that had felt perfectly adequate for him and Ethan suddenly seemed small and cluttered, in need of serious reorganization if it was going to accommodate 2 additional people with their own belongings and needs. "Dad, you're doing that pacing thing again," Ethan observed from his perch at the kitchen table where he was supposedly doing homework, but obviously monitoring his father's unusual behavior. "Victoria and Lily might be staying with us for a while," Daniel said, deciding that honesty was the best policy. "How would you feel about that?" Ethan's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really, like living here? Maybe. It's complicated, but Victoria made some big changes at her job, and they need a place to stay while they figure things out. Can Lily have the guest room? Can we set up bunk beds? Can we build a treehouse in the backyard?" Ethan's questions tumbled over each other in his excitement. "Slow down, buddy. We'll figure out all the details as we go, but yeah, I think Lily can have the guest room." "This is the best day ever," Ethan declared, and Daniel felt a warm surge of gratitude for his son's open heart and natural generosity. That evening, as the sun was setting behind the peaks and painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and yellow, heard the familiar sound of tires on gravel. But this time, when Victoria and Lily emerged from the car, they were carrying suitcases and boxes instead of day packs and picnic supplies. "We're here," Lily announced, hobbling up the porch steps on her still healing leg with an enormous grin on her face. "Mom told me everything, and I think this is going to be amazing." Ethan appeared in the doorway like he'd been shot from a cannon, and the next few minutes were a chaos of excited children and luggage and explanations about sleeping arrangements and house rules. Watching it all unfold, Daniel felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't experienced since before Sarah's illness. The sense of a family coming together, of pieces clicking into place in ways that felt both surprising and inevitable. "How did she take the news?" he asked Victoria quietly, as they watched the children race around the cabin, Lily claiming territory, and Ethan offering guided tours. "Better than I hoped. She said she was tired of having to be perfect all the time, tired of schools where everyone knew how much money her mother made." Victoria's smile was soft and proud. "She said she wanted to learn how to catch fish and build campfires and identify constellations without using an app. We can teach her all of that." "We..." The word had slipped out naturally, but Daniel realized he meant it completely. "We. You and me together. partners in this weird adventure we're apparently embarking on. Victoria stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gratitude and love and terror all mixed together in her dark eyes. Partners in crime, you mean? The best kind. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of adjustment and discovery as two separate families learned how to become something new together. There were logistical challenges, figuring out bathroom schedules and grocery budgets expanded to feed 4 people, and the complex dynamics of suddenly blended sleeping arrangements. But there were also magical moments that made every complication worthwhile. Daniel woke up Wednesday morning to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen and found Victoria teaching Ethan how to make proper French toast, while Lily regaled them both with stories about her father's disastrous attempts at cooking. The scene was so domestic, so natural, that for a moment he forgot they'd known each other for less than 2 months. "Morning, sleepyhead," Victoria said, turning to kiss his cheek as he reached for the coffee pot. "We were just planning today's adventure." "Which is fishing," Lily announced proudly. "Ethan says there's a stream where we can catch real trout, and Victoria promised to clean whatever I catch." "I said I'd learn to clean whatever you catch," Victoria corrected with a laugh. "There's a significant difference." "I can teach you," Daniel offered. "My dad taught me when I was about Ethan's age. It's one of those skills you never forget, like riding a bicycle or changing a tire." "2 skills I also need to learn," Victoria admitted. "I'm discovering that being a CEO didn't prepare me for real life nearly as much as I thought it would." They spent the day at Willow Creek, a pristine mountain stream about 20 minutes from the cabin, where the trout were plentiful and the scenery was spectacular. Daniel watched Victoria gamely learn to bait hooks and cast lines, her expensive outdoor gear gradually getting muddy and rumpled as she embraced the messiness of actual wilderness experience. "This is harder than it looks in movies," she said, after her 4th failed attempt to cast without tangling her line in the overhanging branches. "Everything worthwhile is harder than it looks in movies," Daniel replied, moving behind her to adjust her stance and guide her arm through the proper motion. "The trick is not to overthink it. Just feel the rhythm." When Victoria finally hooked her first trout, a beautiful rainbow that fought hard before Daniel helped her land it, her whoop of triumph echoed across the valley. Lily and Ethan cheered from their own spots along the bank, and Daniel felt that same sense of rightness that had been growing stronger each day since Victoria's dramatic resignation. "I caught a fish," Victoria announced to the world, holding up her prize with the pride of someone who'd just climbed Everest. "I actually caught a fish." "You did?" Daniel confirmed, grinning at her excitement. "And now you get to learn how to clean it." "Oh God, I forgot about that part." That evening, as they sat around a campfire in Daniel's backyard eating the trout they'd caught and cleaned together, Lily asked the question that had been hovering unspoken over their improvised family gathering. "Are we going to stay here, like, permanently?" Victoria looked at Daniel, and he saw his own hopes reflected in her expression. "Would you like to stay here permanently?" "Yes," Lily said without hesitation. "I like it here. I like having a friend my age who doesn't care about designer clothes or expensive vacations. I like learning to do things with my hands, instead of just reading about them online." She paused, studying her mother's face. "Do you want to stay?" "I want to stay wherever you're happy," Victoria said carefully. "But yes, I think I'd like to stay here too." "What about Dad?" "What about my school in New York?" Daniel watched Victoria navigate this delicate conversation, recognizing the weight of the decisions they were all contemplating. Moving across the country wasn't just a change of address. It was a complete reimagining of their lives, their relationships, their futures. "Your father and I will work out a new custody arrangement," Victoria said gently. "Maybe you'll spend summers with him or school vacations. As for school, there's a good elementary school in town that Ethan goes to. It's smaller than your old school, but the teachers are excellent. Will I still get to take piano lessons? There's a music teacher in Grand Junction who comes up here twice a week, Daniel offered. Mrs. Patterson. She's been teaching kids in this area for 30 years. Lily nodded solemnly, processing all this information with the seriousness of someone making an adult decision. Okay, I think I want to try it. Just try it, Ethan asked, clearly hoping for a more definitive commitment. Try it for real, Lily clarified. Like move here and see if it works. But if it doesn't work, we can figure out something else, right? Right, Victoria confirmed. Nothing has to be permanent unless we want it to be. But even as she said it, Daniel could see in her expression that she was already thinking of this place, this life as home in a way that surprised them both. The following weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both extraordinary and completely natural. Victoria threw herself into the practical aspects of their relocation with the same intensity she'd once brought to corporate acquisitions, researching schools and doctors and legal requirements, while simultaneously learning the more mundane skills of mountain living, how to split firewood, how to winterize a cabin, how to stock a pantry for potential blizzards. Daniel found himself falling deeper in love not just with the woman Victoria was becoming, but with the family they were creating together. Watching Ethan teach Lily how to skip stones, or seeing Victoria master the art of pancake flipping, filled him with a contentment he'd thought was lost forever. You know what the strangest part of all this is? Victoria said one evening, as they sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for some crisis or complication that proves this was all a terrible mistake. And nothing happens. The sky doesn't fall, the world doesn't end. We just keep living this ordinary, extraordinary life, and it keeps getting better instead of worse. Daniel took her hand, marveling as always at how perfectly it fit in his. Maybe that's what happiness actually looks like, not the dramatic highs and lows, but just the steady accumulation of good days. Is that what this is, happiness? What would you call it? Victoria was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Peace, maybe. The feeling that I'm finally where I'm supposed to be, doing what I'm supposed to be doing, with the people I'm supposed to be with. That sounds like happiness to me. Then yes, Victoria said, leaning against his shoulder. I think this is happiness. The first real test of their new configuration came in late October, when Victoria's ex-husband arrived unannounced to assess their living situation and determine whether it was suitable for his daughter. James Hale was everything Daniel had expected. Polished, expensive, and radiating the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having been told no about anything that really mattered. So you're the firefighter, James said, when Victoria introduced them, managing to make the profession sound vaguely disreputable. Ex-firefighter, Daniel corrected mildly. I work in hardware retail now. How rustic. James looked around the cabin with the barely concealed disdain of someone surveying a particularly unfortunate archaeological dig. And this is where you expect my daughter to live. This is where your daughter has been living for the past month, Victoria said, with steel in her voice. Very happily, I might add. Daddy. Lily appeared from the kitchen, where she'd been helping Ethan with his math homework. You came to see our new house. Daniel watched James's expression soften as he looked at his daughter, noting the genuine love there despite his obvious disapproval of their circumstances. Whatever else he might be, James was clearly a devoted father trying to do what he thought was best for his child. Hi, sweetheart. How are you liking it here? I love it, Lily said without hesitation. I learned how to gut a fish and identify bird calls and build a fire without matches. And Ethan taught me how to find the Big Dipper even when there are clouds. That's wonderful, James said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. And you're keeping up with your studies. Mrs. Henderson says I'm doing great in math, and my writing teacher thinks I should enter the state essay contest. Want to see my rock collection? I found a piece of actual quartz yesterday. As Lily dragged her father off to examine her various wilderness treasures, Victoria sank into a chair with a heavy sigh. He thinks we've lost our minds, she said. Have we? Daniel asked lightly. Probably, but I'd rather be crazy and happy than sane and miserable. James stayed for dinner, and Daniel had to admit that whatever his faults, Lily's father was making a genuine effort to understand their new life. He asked thoughtful questions about the local school system, listened carefully to Ethan's enthusiastic descriptions of their hiking adventures, and even complimented Victoria on the meal she'd prepared. I have to admit, he said, as they lingered over coffee and dessert. Lily seems happier than I've seen her in months. More confident, more engaged with the world around her. She's had room to be herself here, Victoria replied. No pressure to be perfect, no expectations beyond being a good person and working hard in school. And no designer clothes or expensive tutors or social pressures, James added with a rueful smile. I suppose there are advantages to simplicity that I hadn't considered. After James left the next morning with promises to work out a reasonable custody arrangement and grudging acknowledgement that their unconventional family was clearly working, Daniel found Victoria standing in the kitchen staring out at the mountains with an expression of profound relief. One hurdle down, she said. How many more to go? I'm trying not to count. It's less intimidating that way. November brought the first serious snow, and with it a new set of challenges and discoveries. Victoria learned to drive in winter conditions. Lily experienced the magic of a real snow day when school was canceled due to blizzard conditions, and all four of them discovered the peculiar intimacy that comes from being snowed in together for 3 days, with nothing to do but talk and play games and share the kind of stories that usually only emerge during power outages and family emergencies. I love this, Lily said on the second day, curled up next to the fireplace with a hot chocolate and the book she was reading for school. In New York, snow just meant everything was dirty and harder. Here it makes everything beautiful. Even when you can't go anywhere for days, Ethan asked. He'd grown up with mountain winters, but he was still sometimes surprised by newcomers' reactions to the isolation. Especially then. It makes the house feel cozy instead of small, like we're all connected because we have to take care of each other. Daniel caught Victoria's eye across the room and saw his own thoughts reflected there. This was what family felt like, not the legal arrangements or financial obligations or social expectations, but the simple willingness to weather storms together, literally and figuratively. December brought another milestone when Victoria officially enrolled Lily in the local elementary school for the spring semester. It was a practical decision that carried enormous symbolic weight, marking their transition from temporary visitors to permanent residents. Are you nervous? Daniel asked Lily the night before her first day at the new school. A little, but Ethan says everyone's really nice and Mrs. Henderson promised I can join the after-school art program. Lily was quiet for a moment, then looked up at him with the serious expression she wore when contemplating weighty matters. Daniel, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think my mom is happier now? Really happier, not just pretending to be happy? The question caught Daniel off guard with its perceptiveness. What do you think, Cho? I think she is. She laughs more and she doesn't check her phone every 5 minutes anymore. She sings in the kitchen when she thinks nobody's listening. Lily paused, studying his face. Do you love her? Yes, Daniel said simply. I do. Good. She loves you too, in case you were wondering. She told me so. She did. She said you make her want to be the best version of herself, and that's what love is supposed to do. Lily grinned. Plus, she thinks you're really cute, but she made me promise not to tell you that part. Daniel laughed, feeling lighter than he had in days. Your secret's safe with me. Christmas that year was unlike anything any of them had experienced before. Instead of the elaborate productions of Victoria's corporate life or the quiet, sometimes melancholy celebrations Daniel and Ethan had shared in previous years, they created something entirely new. A holiday that blended traditions from both families, while establishing new ones that belonged uniquely to them. They cut their own tree from the forest behind the cabin, decorated it with a mixture of store-bought ornaments and handmade creations from the children's art projects. They cooked Christmas dinner together with everyone contributing something to the menu, and nobody worrying about whether the presentation was magazine-worthy. This is the best Christmas ever, Ethan declared, as they sat around the fireplace on Christmas evening, surrounded by wrapping paper and new books, and the comfortable chaos of a well-celebrated holiday. Even better than the one where Santa brought you the remote control helicopter? Daniel asked, remembering Ethan's previous record holder for holiday excellence. Way better. Because this year we have a whole family, instead of just pieces of families. Victoria looked at Daniel over the children's heads, and he saw tears in her eyes. But they were good tears, the kind that came from gratitude and overwhelming joy rather than loss or sadness. Pieces of families, she repeated softly. I like that. We're not pieces anymore, Lily added with the confidence of a child who'd found her place in the world. We're whole. The new year brought new challenges and new adventures. Victoria started a consulting business focused on sustainable development, working with small companies that wanted to grow responsibly rather than just profitably. It was work that utilized her business skills while aligning with her values, and Daniel could see her confidence returning as she built something that felt authentic and meaningful. I have a proposal for you, she said one evening in February, as they sat on the porch despite the cold, bundled in blankets, and sharing a thermos of hot coffee. Another one. I'm still recovering from your last proposal to reorganize the kitchen cabinets. This one's bigger. Victoria's expression grew serious. I want to buy the old Murphy place. Daniel nearly choked on his coffee. Murphy's property bordered their own, a larger plot, with a substantial house that had been on the market for months, without finding a buyer willing to take on its necessary renovations. That's a big project, Victoria. The house needs a lot of work. I know. But think about it: more space for the kids' room, for my home office, a proper guest room for when James visits Lily. Plus, we could fix it up together, make it exactly what we want, instead of adapting to what's already there. Daniel could see the vision forming in her eyes, and he felt his own excitement building despite his practical concerns about budgets and timelines and the 1,000 things that could go wrong with a major renovation project. He asked. We. Unless you're not ready to make that kind of commitment. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond real estate decisions. Was he ready to fully merge their lives, to take on the financial and emotional responsibilities of true partnership? Was he ready to stop thinking of Victoria and Lily as wonderful additions to his life and start thinking of them as permanent, essential parts of his future? I'm ready, he said, and meant it completely. Let's buy a house. The next few months were a whirlwind of inspections and negotiations and paperwork, followed by the controlled chaos of renovation work that seemed to expand exponentially with each new discovery about the house's quirks and needs. But there was something deeply satisfying about working together to create a home that would truly belong to all of them, something that had never existed before they imagined it into being. "I think we're crazy," Victoria said one afternoon in May, as they stood in what would eventually be their kitchen, surrounded by paint samples and cabinet hardware and the accumulated debris of extensive remodeling. "Definitely crazy," Daniel agreed. "But the good kind of crazy." "Is there a good kind of crazy? The kind where you make decisions based on love instead of logic. The kind where you take risks because the potential rewards are too amazing to pass up." Daniel pulled her into his arms, not caring that they were both covered in sawdust and paint. "The kind where you save a little girl from a ravine and end up saving yourself in the process." Victoria's smile was radiant. "When you put it that way, crazy sounds pretty reasonable." They moved into the renovated house in late June just as the wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the high meadows, and the summer hiking season was getting into full swing. The children had their own rooms for the first time since the previous autumn, but they still ended up sleeping in a tent in the backyard on their first night in the new house, claiming they wanted to camp out to celebrate the occasion. "Do you think they're happy?" Victoria asked, as they watched Ethan and Lily tell ghost stories by flashlight through the tent walls. "Look at them. They're creating memories they'll carry for the rest of their lives. Of course they're happy. What about you? Are you happy?" Daniel considered the question, looking around at the house they'd rebuilt together, the family they'd created from the wreckage of their separate losses, the future that stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and adventure. "I'm more than happy," he said finally. "I'm home." 1 year later, Daniel stood in the same meadow where he'd first rescued Lily. But this time he was wearing his best suit, and his heart was pounding for entirely different reasons. The wedding ceremony was small and simple, just their immediate family, Murphy, and a few close friends from town, and the minister who'd agreed to perform the service in this place that had brought them together. "Are you nervous?" Ethan asked, adjusting his tie with the seriousness of someone taking his best man duties very seriously. "Terrified," Daniel admitted. "But the good kind of terrified. Like before your first time skydiving." "I've never been skydiving." "Like before your first time going on a date with Victoria." Daniel laughed. "Yeah, like that." The ceremony itself was everything Daniel had hoped it would be: personal, meaningful, and focused on the promises they were making to each other rather than the spectacle of the event. When Victoria appeared at the end of the short aisle they'd created between two stands of aspen trees, wearing a simple white dress and carrying wildflowers the children had picked that morning, Daniel felt his heart stop and restart with the certainty that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. "You look beautiful," he whispered as she reached him. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she whispered back. And then they were both laughing, because this was them, practical, down-to-earth, finding joy in the simple reality of choosing each other every day. The vows they'd written were promises to continue growing together, to face whatever challenges lay ahead, as partners, to build a life based on love and shared values rather than external expectations. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their children cheered so loudly that a flock of ravens took flight from a nearby pine tree, cawing their own congratulations to the mountain air. "So," Victoria said, as they walked back toward the reception area Murphy had helped them set up near the edge of the meadow. "How does it feel to be married to a former billionaire?" "How does it feel to be married to a small-town hardware store employee?" Daniel countered. "Like the best decision I've ever made." "Same here." As the afternoon wore on and their small gathering of friends and family celebrated with dancing and stories and laughter that echoed across the valley, Daniel found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A child's accident, a split-second decision to help a stranger, a series of choices that had seemed small at the time, but had ultimately reshaped both their lives completely. "No regrets," he asked Victoria as they swayed together during their first dance as a married couple. Only one, she said, and Daniel's heart clenched until she continued. I regret that it took us so long to find each other. We found each other exactly when we were supposed to, Daniel replied. Any earlier, and we wouldn't have been ready. Any later, and... He trailed off, not wanting to think about a world where Lily had never fallen into that ravine where their paths had never crossed. Any later, and we would have missed our chance, Victoria finished. But we didn't miss it. We grabbed it with both hands and held on tight. And we're still holding on. Always. As the sun set behind the peaks and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Daniel looked around at the life they'd built together. The children who'd become siblings by choice rather than blood. The community that had embraced their unconventional family. The woman who'd had the courage to give up everything she'd known for something she'd only dared to dream about. This was what love looked like in real life, he realized. Not the dramatic gestures or perfect moments of movies and romance novels, but the daily choice to show up for each other, to build something lasting together, to find extraordinary meaning in ordinary moments. The accident on the mountain hadn't been fate's cruelty as he'd once thought. It had been fate's gift, a chance for two broken families to become whole, for two people who'd lost their way to find each other, for love to prove that second chances were not only possible, but worth every risk required to claim them. And as Victoria laughed at something Lily whispered in her ear, as Ethan spun around the makeshift dance floor, with the unrestrained joy of a child whose world had suddenly expanded to include everything he'd ever wanted, Daniel knew with absolute certainty that some stories really did have happy endings. This was theirs.